Chapter 1, Fortune Arrives. Broken bricks and shattered tiles, wild grass growing rampant amidst the ruins. Compared to this tenacious vitality, the incomplete high-rise building standing desolately on one side appeared even more desolate. Abandoned scaffolding, wooden fences, and an unfinished low brick wall surrounding the area helplessly revealed that this place was once a construction site. No one liked this scene of destruction, but if one climbed up high and looked down, those unsightly elements shrank into toy-like pieces, and the feeling of disdain seemed to lessen somewhat. Indeed, as the old saying goes, love the heights, love the heights. Standing at a high vantage point, whether it's the view or the feeling, everything seems better, perhaps even instilling the courage to jump down. Someone was struggling to climb the stairs. Of course, one couldn't expect an elevator to be operational in an abandoned building, so if you wanted to reach the rooftop, climbing these 20-something flights of stairs was the only way. Sweat and heavy breathing revealed the exhaustion, yet this man still carried a crate of beer, showing no intention of giving up this beloved liquid despite the effort. The drunken man arduously climbed upward. John Rivers could no longer remember how many times he had climbed to the rooftop. Some people like mountain climbing, while others enjoy flying. Perhaps it's because they all share a love for the feeling of being above everything, looking down at the world. It's always better than looking up with admiration, at least, it makes one feel much better. On the rooftop, even the ruins below seemed insignificant. At this moment, the gloom in his heart seemed to dissipate significantly. As a small, struggling office worker accustomed to being ordered around, even he had grown used to the name John Rivers. His real name, apart from being known by his parents, seemed to have been forgotten by everyone else. No matter how tough life gets, it requires some form of adjustment. Everyone has their own way of relieving stress, otherwise, it's hard to avoid going mad. Near John Rivers' residence stood a nearly 20-story building, originally intended to become a luxury apartment complex. If that had been the case, perhaps John Rivers would have had to endure the disdainful glances of those living high above. Unfortunately, the unscrupulous developer apparently had no intention of fulfilling the wishes of the homebuyers. Not long after the first building was erected, some issues arose, and the developer absconded with the money. Thus, what should have been a grand luxury apartment complex turned into an unsightly, abandoned building. Of course, such a large area hosting only a lone, unfinished building was peculiar. There would inevitably be someone or some organization tasked with resolving the issue. However, resolving such matters takes time, meetings, minor surveys, reports, and so on, all of which are time-consuming. So, before the abandoned building could be dealt with, it became John Rivers' stress relief haven. Naturally, he wouldn't roam around the entire building. Just the rooftop alone was enough for him to unload everything. For someone as physically frail as John Rivers, climbing over 20 floors was quite a challenge. But with enough time and a slow pace, he would eventually reach the top. After smashing yet another beer bottle, John Rivers found himself too exhausted to curse anymore. He lay flat on the rooftop, gazing at the twinkling stars above. Filled with sorrow and self-pity, he reflected on nearly 30 years of his life. Regrettably, such retrospection only deepened his gloom. As the alcohol took hold, John Rivers suddenly felt as if the stars above were emitting a cold, distant light. Could it be that even they didn't want to hear his complaints? Had he turned his head to look, perhaps John Rivers wouldn't have had the energy to curse the entire starry sky. But as a drunk and fatigued man, who would bother to turn their head and glance around? A blinding red light was hurtling from afar. Based on its trajectory, barring any surprises, the abandoned building with its solitary silhouette was the target. More precisely, the target was John Rivers, sprawled out on the rooftop in the shape of the Chinese character for big. Whether it smashed into the desolate building or flattened a useless man, this event was bound to leave people baffled. John Rivers, squinting at the sky, was naturally unaware that his lucky break was about to arrive. Nor did he know that many people across the city, armed with binoculars and cameras, were shouting in excitement over a red meteor. The astronomy enthusiasts, leaping with joy, seemed unconcerned about the fact that this meteor was about to crash into their city. Even knowing that as long as it didn't hit their own head, witnessing this event firsthand still made people excited. Amid their excitement, that crimson light struck the rooftop. On the rooftop of the 20-something-story building stood a man named John Rivers. The collision happened in an instant, no explosion, no rumbling noise, no scene of concrete flying everywhere, and certainly no screams of distress. The crimson light disappeared within a second. It was clear that it had struck the rooftop, yet it caused no damage and vanished without a trace. The building didn't even lose a single fragment of debris. The only change was that John Rivers disappeared. The next day, many astronomy enthusiasts and related agencies gathered in front of the abandoned building. Based on calculations by experts and estimates by enthusiasts, the crimson light, which they believed to be a meteor, had fallen somewhere nearby. They found nothing. The building was undamaged, there was no meteorite impact crater nearby, and forget meteors, there wasn't even a single hooligan around. As a result, everyone left disappointed. One particular expert, who had injured his foot and shoe by stepping on a broken beer bottle on the rooftop, was especially dissatisfied. After coming down, he loudly criticized those who irresponsibly littered on rooftops. Still not appeased after his rant, he angrily spat on the ground, hitting the windshield of a car in a very conspicuous manner. The expert snorted coldly, raised his head high, and walked away, still cursing those with no sense of public decency in his heart. Flowers bloomed vibrantly, greenery flourished, the sky was blue with white clouds, and the rivers and landscapes exuded charm, somewhat resembling an idyllic paradise. Therefore, John Rivers was certain he was dreaming. He vaguely remembered being on the rooftop of an abandoned building, drinking, and now suddenly finding himself in this place. The only explanation was that he was dreaming. However, this dream wasn't bad at all. So, he hugged his knees, sitting there and seriously enjoying this rare moment of serene beauty. Then he heard voices, which made John Rivers slightly annoyed. People who are dreaming, especially those in a good dream, generally dislike being disturbed and don't want to wake up to face the dullness of reality. Thus, John Rivers tried to ignore the sound, focusing inward to push that damned noise out of his dream. The result was predictable, he failed. So, John Rivers woke up angrily, guessing that the one who disturbed him was most likely that stubborn, annoying old man. In truth, the old man wasn't stubborn or annoying. He was simply in charge of patrolling the abandoned building and its surrounding area. But this job was something John Rivers neither understood nor valued. He couldn't fathom why anyone would guard an unfinished building. Was there really some lunatic who'd break apart concrete to sell for money? More than once, while John Rivers was lamenting his unfortunate life on the rooftop and numbing himself with alcohol, the old man would appear like a ghost. Though he never chased him away, the man would gently preach about life to the disheartened young man and insist he leave. John Rivers didn't like this old man with his fake, ever-present smile. So, this time, he decided to turn the tables and teach the man a lesson he wouldn't forget. Opening his eyes, John Rivers hadn't even begun searching for his target when he realized things weren't as he had imagined. It was clearly daytime now. Though the sky was overcast, for a clear-headed, sober adult, distinguishing between day and night was an easy task. John Rivers thought, could it be that he was drunk until morning? That explanation wasn't entirely wrong, but the problem was that the place he was in didn't look anything like the familiar rooftop. Most people, when faced with something incomprehensible, are first struck with such astonishment that their minds go blank, only to gradually calm down and start contemplating their situation and possible ways out. Perhaps having endured too many hardships and setbacks, John Rivers' resilience towards such peculiar events had grown quite strong. As a result, he was able to quickly observe everything around him and attempt to find a reasonable explanation. He was lying inside a glass coffin, or no, if John Rivers had enough knowledge, he would have realized that this so-called glass coffin was actually made of crystal, a crystal coffin. The old man patrolling nearby clearly didn't possess the capability or inclination to pull off such a malicious prank, so John Rivers began searching for clues elsewhere. Not far away, there were two people. It seemed the voices he had heard in his dream must have come from them. They were talking, but John Rivers subconsciously ignored the content of their conversation. What caught his attention first was their attire, not because he wanted to judge their fashion sense, but because their outfits were truly striking, even from behind. The man standing with his hands clasped behind his back appeared extremely tall. By John Rivers' estimation, he was likely around 1.9 meters or taller. He wore a long black robe, and his long black hair flowed loosely down his back. Whether it was because he hadn't washed it for a long time or not, John Rivers couldn't tell. Even though he could feel the wind, the man's hair remained completely still. This image immediately reminded John Rivers of ancient characters from comic books. The other person was slightly less imposing. Although he also wore a long robe, the color of his attire seemed to have originally been light blue but had faded to a pale white from age. His hair was tied up in a crooked bun, with a small dark brown wooden sword, about 4 inches long, creatively stuck into it. Based on John Rivers' analysis, this person's appearance resembled that of a Taoist priest. With graying hair and both hands clasped together inside the opposite sleeve, he looked like an aging, down-on-his-luck Taoist who had seen better days and didn't pay much attention to his appearance. Surrounding them was nothing but golden rocks and the dark clouds in the sky, suggesting they were standing on some mountaintop. Despite racking his brain, John Rivers couldn't fathom how, after simply drinking some wine on the rooftop, even if he had gotten completely drunk, he could end up encountering these two strange individuals. Moreover, he had the misfortune of waking up inside a glass coffin. With his personality, there was no way he resembled a prince waiting to be awakened by a princess's passionate kiss. So what kind of absurd scenario was this? Unable to make sense of it, and being someone who preferred to keep to himself, John Rivers decided to quietly remain lying still. However, he perked up his ears to listen. But at that moment, the voices stopped. Ethan Stone stopped speaking because he didn't want to, leaving Victor Sage no choice but to obediently stand beside him, pretending to enjoy the scenery. Unfortunately, this was a desolate mountaintop. Looking far out, there was nothing but dark clouds above and dust below. The rare patches of vegetation were pitifully small and frail. Victor Sage's gaze had no option but to settle on these nameless plants struggling to survive. Over the years, I should have thanked you for your assistance, but today might be the last time. Ethan Stone spoke slowly, his sleeve waving casually. Under Victor Sage's watchful eyes, the slightly withered plants suddenly turned lush and green again, with a faint layer of dew appearing on their leaves. If John Rivers had witnessed this scene, he would have undoubtedly exclaimed in astonishment, "Good heavens!" Chapter 2, The Living Dead. Victor Sage reluctantly withdrew his gaze. Thanks to Ethan Stone's mystical energy, these fragile plants could survive for at least a few more days in such a harsh environment. After all these years of preparation, isn't it all for today? What's this? You're only now remembering to be polite to me? Victor Sage laughed heartily, turning to look at Ethan Stone. Ethan Stone smirked, a faint smile appearing on his face. To witness this once-in-a-millennium moment, truthfully, you should be thanking me instead. Victor Sage suddenly grew melancholic. John Rivers, on the other hand, was filled with confusion. A once-in-a-millennium event? Is Jesus or Buddha descending to the mortal world again? John Rivers wondered, lost in thought. Although you prepared a backup plan, if things don't go as you expected, wouldn't it all be for nothing? Decades of painstaking effort to create this vessel, if it becomes useless, what will you do? Ethan Stone turned around. Before him stood an open crystal coffin. Inside the coffin lay John Rivers, motionless with his eyes closed. Coffins are typically meant for the dead, but the person inside this crystal coffin had a chest that faintly rose and fell. Though the breaths were slow, it was clear he was alive. After all, only the living breathe. To Ethan Stone and Victor Sage, however, this was no ordinary living person. To them, he was the living dead. The face of this so-called living corpse appeared to belong to someone around 17 or 18 years old, but his body resembled that of a robust man. His skin was a bronze hue, his muscular physique bare, exuding a strength that seemed almost boundless. Unfortunately, he was still lying in a coffin. Even if it was a crystal one, a coffin was a coffin. Ethan Stone glanced at Victor Sage. Looking at him, do you feel any guilt? Victor Sage took a deep breath. This was your idea. Guilt? John Rivers, with his eyes closed, suddenly remembered something. He wasn't wearing anything. Could it be that these two had some unusual preferences? As John Rivers worried about his dignity, he failed to notice the monumental changes in his own body, at least in terms of appearance. Of course it was my idea, Ethan Stone said with a wry smile. I found this child who was born with a soulless condition. Without your help, I could never have cultivated this soulless vessel into what it is now. For that, I owe you a great debt. Victor Sage tilted his head. To be honest, I had my own motives. If I hadn't wanted to witness the results of your ascension experiment, I wouldn't have poured all my efforts into helping you create such a perfect vessel. It's just convenient for an old monster like you to have a body to possess, in case your ascension fails. The two men stood atop a desolate mountain, conversing around a crystal coffin. The scene was utterly devoid of any poetic charm. But John Rivers' scalp had started to go numb. Damn it, I've been excelling in studies since kindergarten. How could I end up as an unlucky young man suffering from soul loss? And what's more, ascension? Furnace? Wait, I think I've read about furnaces in novels before, but I can't seem to recall what it means right now. Hold on, could these two oddly dressed people have escaped from a mental hospital? Or are they filming a movie? But I don't see any cameras around, and besides, no director or producer has ever paid attention to me. John Rivers' mind was in complete chaos. Although the conversation seemed casual, when the national advisor of the heavenly capital kingdom and the continent's top martial artist were together, even their nonsense would likely inspire admiration. Victor Sage, the national advisor of the heavenly capital kingdom, the most powerful nation on the continent, rarely left the astrology platform, except for performing divinations and rituals for the royal family. Who could possibly invite him down otherwise? Ethan Stone, who had roamed the continent for decades, had challenged countless masters, without ever tasting defeat. Aside from reclusive experts, who among the worldly masters dared deny that Ethan Stone was the greatest under heaven? But John Rivers felt no admiration. He was simply confused, more and more confused. Unbeknownst to him, these two legendary figures had gathered today for a momentous event. That event was none other than Ethan Stone's daylight ascension. If it were someone else thinking like that, Victor Sage would probably scold them for daydreaming in broad daylight. But the one with such intentions was Ethan Stone, and that was a different matter entirely. Because over a decade ago, Victor Sage had been invited to assist Ethan Stone in preparing for certain matters, the most notable being when Ethan Stone arrived carrying a 3- or 4-year-old boy. At that moment, Victor Sage's hands began trembling uncontrollably. The astrological tower was the place where the royal advisor of the heavenly capital kingdom practiced his spiritual path. Victor Sage had many disciples, and with the royal guards of the imperial city stationed there, it should have been as impenetrable as water flowing off a lotus leaf. However, to Ethan Stone, such defenses were clearly insignificant. Victor Sage was not surprised that Ethan Stone could silently infiltrate the astrological tower. In truth, Victor Sage himself had once sneaked into the heavily guarded royal palace just to steal some imperial wine for his enjoyment. Although he could have simply asked for it and would have been supplied with an endless amount of imperial wine, the stolen wine always tasted better than the rewarded wine, at least, that was Victor Sage's firm belief. Ethan Stone sought out Victor Sage to ask for a favor, to eliminate the 5 senses and 6 faculties of the child he had brought along. More importantly, the child had to remain alive. Not only alive but thriving, with physical functions that could only surpass those of ordinary people. Victor Sage had the capability to fulfill Ethan Stone's request, but he hesitated and felt reluctant. A child so full of potential, yet destined to be turned into a living corpse, such a cruel act was truly difficult for the royal advisor to carry out, especially in a sacred place like the astrological tower. The veins on Victor Sage's forehead bulged, making it hard for him to decide in the moment. Thus, Ethan Stone explained to him, this child was born mentally dull, the type people often describe as soulless. Because they lack a soul, their mind is muddled, unable to discern right from wrong. However, Ethan Stone's words of comfort failed to move Victor Sage. Glaring, he retorted that soulless nonsense is just foolish talk from ignorant people. Do you believe me or not? Give me 3 days, and I can cure this child. Ethan Stone, of course, wasn't there to treat the child. Seeing Victor Sage hesitate, he asked pointedly, why do you think I came to you specifically, instead of seeking someone else? Victor Sage was momentarily stunned. You sought me out because you know I can do what you need. Then why, Ethan Stone sneered, after understanding this so-called cruel secret art, do you still pretend to be some benevolent sage who pities all living beings? Victor Sage's face flushed red immediately. Just because I understand it, must I act on it? If I know medicine, must I become a doctor? If I know how to cook, must I become a chef? At this point, Victor Sage abruptly stopped speaking, for Ethan Stone had placed the young boy in front of him, his fingers tapping dozens of points on the child's body in quick succession. Afterward, Ethan Stone said nothing, and Victor Sage fell silent as well. Though Ethan Stone's action seemed simple, in reality, he had severed all of the child's vital energy. Unless Victor Sage used forbidden techniques to turn the boy into a living corpse, the child wouldn't survive more than a few days. Left with no choice, Victor Sage had to comply. I always thought that you and I, as seekers of the Tao, whether martial or heavenly, were ultimately compassionate people. I never imagined I'd have to commit such a heinous act against human decency today, Victor Sage said, his face pale, though his hands didn't stop moving. Ethan Stone looked at him coldly. I already told you, I need a vessel that can harmonize with me, so that I can later seize it for my own use. Victor Sage, irritated, didn't even raise his head. How the hell was I supposed to know you'd actually find one? This is harder than finding a needle in a haystack. Someone born with a muddled mind but capable of achieving clarity in their spiritual consciousness, and more importantly, someone who can harmonize with your nascent soul, damn it, you actually managed to find one. The act of seizing a body and being reborn is often something that exists only in legends. In the thousands of years of the continent's history, there are records of successful body possession, but none have been verified. Not everyone can use this defiance of heaven method. First, the person attempting to seize a body must have reached the spirit connection realm. Only upon reaching this realm can one form a nascent soul, and it is only with a nascent soul that body possession becomes possible. Next, simply having the cultivation of the spirit connection realm does not mean one can casually take over someone else's body. It must be understood that every person has their own consciousness. Forcibly suppressing or even destroying the original consciousness, while not overly difficult, causes irreversible damage to the body. Even if the possession succeeds, the body and the nascent soul may never fully harmonize. Not only would the practitioner's power be vastly diminished, but they could also end up trapped in the seized body, unable to escape. Thus, body possession requires finding someone who is naturally simple-minded or mentally impaired. Folklore suggests that such individuals have incomplete souls. Because their minds are undeveloped, their spiritual platform is like a blank sheet of paper, offering no resistance after possession. Finally, even if one finds a host with a pure spiritual platform, it may not necessarily be suitable for possession. Just as every person has a unique physique, clothing must also be tailored to fit. If the clothing does not fit, even the most exquisite robes are useless. For these reasons, although body possession may sound like a method for achieving eternal life, very few actually use it. Ethan Stone, however, wanted to prepare a body for potential possession as a precaution. He feared that if his ascension failed and his physical body was destroyed, he could still latch onto another body to be reborn. What he seemed not to consider was whether his nascent soul would even survive if his body were destroyed during failure. Perhaps he had thought of this seemingly simple issue but found comfort in having a backup plan, even if it wasn't entirely reliable. And so, over more than 10 years, the young boy's body matured under Victor Sage's careful manipulation. At last, Ethan Stone was ready to take the step toward ascension. The wind on the desolate mountain blew fiercely, causing their robes to flutter wildly. Ethan Stone looked up silently, while Victor Sage understood that his old friend was ready to begin. Victor Sage was not a man of many words, but at this moment, a vague thought surfaced in his mind, one to stop or at least delay Ethan Stone. After all, such a matter as ascending to the heavens in broad daylight seemed like something no one had ever accomplished. What if, Victor Sage coughed lightly, just in case, what if you fail? If the soul transfer doesn't succeed, wouldn't all your lifelong skills and knowledge be lost? After so many years, surely there must be some talented youth fortunate enough to inherit your legacy? These words were far from auspicious, and Ethan Stone frowned slightly, appearing a bit displeased. Victor Sage clasped his hands behind his back, assuming the demeanor of an enlightened master. His gaze remained steady, deliberately avoiding Ethan Stone's piercing stare, leaving the latter no choice but to relent. You old Taoist already have a successor. Naturally, I've thought about it too. Unfortunately, they're all the same. Hashtag Chapter 3, The Arrival of Unforeseen Circumstances. Ethan Stone's response was quite intriguing. The implication of this statement is that being Ethan Stone's disciple naturally sets one apart from ordinary people. Victor Sage quirkily remarked, "Do you really have to find a peculiar lad to take as your disciple? You're already unique yourself, and now you want to take in a disciple with a personality as eccentric as yours?" Faced with this tactless old Taoist, Ethan Stone often felt helpless. Sometimes, he wondered how such a debauched, irreverent, and average-looking individual could have become the national advisor of heavenly capital. If I want to take on a disciple, he must, of course, be different from everyone else, Ethan Stone asserted firmly. Victor Sage muttered, "Then why not take a monkey as your disciple? That would guarantee absolute uniqueness." Ethan Stone remained silent. John Rivers, amidst the commotion, pretended to be dead. Victor Sage continued to stall, as if prolonging the conversation might dissuade Ethan Stone from his determination to ascend to immortality. What's so bad about this world? With your abilities, you could roam freely anywhere under the heavens. Must you really pursue eternal life and immortality to find satisfaction? Victor Sage always maintained a cautious attitude toward Ethan Stone's desire for transcendence. Ethan Stone pondered for a moment, deciding to respond to the only true friend he had in this life. Life and death. I don't seek immortality out of delusion, it's just that. Ethan Stone looked up again. The sky was still shrouded in dark clouds, obscuring the blue sky and the sun. It's just that I want to know what lies beyond the heavens, like a cricket trapped in a jar, desperate to see the world outside. Restless crickets usually get stomped on, or if they leap out, they might encounter a molting rooster and end up swallowed in one gulp. Victor Sage clearly disapproved of Ethan Stone's answer. At the very least, before that happens, I'll have seen the world outside the jar, Ethan Stone said with a smile. Then he said, "Smelly Taoist, no matter what you say, I'm determined to act today, so you might as well save your energy." John Rivers suddenly felt like he understood a bit. What was this nonsense about ascending to immortality and flying? These two were undoubtedly crazy. He just wasn't sure what the so-called furnace tripod was for. Was it used for some sort of heavenly ritual? If it came down to a life-or-death struggle, even though the other side had the advantage in numbers, he would still fight back with all his might. If he knew that these two could kill him effortlessly with just a breath, who knows if he would still have any thoughts of resisting? Victor Sage sighed. He knew Ethan Stone wouldn't change his mind, so the only thing he could do was lend his friend a hand. The gray-white Taoist robe looked old and lifeless, but as Victor Sage quietly chanted a few words, his body remained still while the robe suddenly inflated as if filled with air, fluttering as though caught in a strong wind and vibrating fiercely. Yet, within a radius of 1 zhang around both him and Ethan Stone, there wasn't the slightest breeze, not even a faint gust. If someone knowledgeable were to witness this scene, they would undoubtedly cry out in astonishment. To carve out a small domain belonging solely to oneself amidst heaven and earth could only be achieved by someone who had reached the spirit connection realm. People might know that the national advisor of heavenly capital was a highly skilled individual, deeply trusted by the royal family, and exceptionally talented in divination. But perhaps no one knew that this Taoist, like Ethan Stone, hailed as the #1 worldly master, was also a spirit connection realm expert. Ethan Stone understood that Victor Sage was doing this to create an absolutely unobstructed space for him. Beyond that, he would have to rely on his own strength. Taking a deep breath, Ethan Stone flexed his arms with force. The sleeves did not flutter, nor did the garments billow in the wind. Outwardly, there was none of the grandeur exuded by Victor Sage. Yet, the dark clouds in the sky seemed to be swept away by an invisible giant hand, revealing a large gap. Through this opening, the sun emerged at just the right moment, its rays finally illuminating the figures of the two individuals. This was a heart-stirring moment, an unprecedented effort being made by the two. Regardless of success or failure, Victor Sage was undoubtedly the most critical witness. As Victor Sage's heartbeat quickened, he suddenly noticed Ethan Stone's movements come to a halt. Ethan's gaze was fixed intently on the glass coffin nearby. Following Ethan's line of sight, Victor Sage turned his head, and his body also froze in place. Like fools, the two peerless masters stood there, wide-eyed and slack-jawed, staring blankly at the glass coffin. John Rivers closed his eyes, but he could sense that something around him seemed to be changing. Although he hadn't witnessed Victor Sage setting up the windless realm with his own eyes, a subtle intuition still told him that something was happening. Thus, he decided to act first, leaping forward to knock one of them out. Then, he escaped from the other, grabbed a set of clothes, and ran off to find someone to report the situation to the authorities. Thankfully, even in this situation, John Rivers retained enough rationality to realize how improper it would be to run around naked in public. But what John Rivers hadn't anticipated was that as soon as he sat up, before he could even leap out of the coffin to execute his attack plan, the gazes of the two strange men had already locked onto him. The atmosphere immediately became peculiar, as if all three of them were frozen in place, unable to move. As a corpse that had just risen from a glass coffin, John Rivers obviously couldn't endure such stares. Hesitantly, he raised a hand and softly said, "Hello." Victor Sage seemed to be in shock, stammering uncontrollably. Ethan Stone, however, recovered more quickly. He lowered his hand and silently observed the frightened corpse, his expression emotionless, his gaze calm and carefree. "He's different." As if continuing the words Victor Sage left unsaid, or perhaps explaining a statement, Ethan Stone calmly uttered these 4 words. Like a thunderclap beside his ear, Victor Sage immediately snapped back to reality. "Of course, I know he's different." A cooked duck suddenly jumping up to lay an egg, any fool would realize this duck is unusual. Victor Sage clenched his fist tightly. Being called a duck out of nowhere, John Rivers felt deeply dissatisfied. Though he might not be particularly talented, he had never resorted to selling himself. Moreover, with his current physique, he doubted he could even manage to make a living that way. At this thought, John Rivers' mind suddenly froze, as he noticed his raised hand, slender, dark, and elegant. It seemed it could easily qualify for a hand model. But the issue was, this wasn't his hand. The three of them fell silent. Victor Sage's gaze burned with intensity, though he seemed at a loss for action. John Rivers cautiously examined his naked body, shifting his focus back to the hand he had raised, his mouth agape in shock, while Ethan Stone appeared to have turned into a statue. John Rivers was an intelligent man with a broad perspective and an active imagination. It didn't take him long to recall his last memory. He had been drinking on the rooftop, smashing bottles for fun, when he suddenly lost consciousness. Upon waking, he found himself in a different body, stark naked, his flawless physique exposed before 2 strange individuals. Strange individuals? Unusual attire, peculiar hairstyles, possibly immortal beings who had attained enlightenment. Could it be? Could it be that the tales written in novels were true? That crossing into another world was real? As this thought occurred, John Rivers' blood rushed to his head. If so, wouldn't the two before him be extraordinary figures? Though he had read many such novels, truly finding himself in another world and facing two enigmatic individuals of unfathomable depth, John Rivers genuinely didn't know how to proceed. Should he perhaps greet them with a casual hello to remind these two to continue their dialogue? Anyway, considering himself a guest, John Rivers decided to wait for these two gentlemen to speak first. That way, he could go with the flow and avoid any abrupt remarks. However, Victor Sage and Ethan Stone clearly had no intention of cooperating. One glared at John Rivers' naked body, while the other seemed to have his eyes closed, whether in deep meditation or asleep was unclear. Still not done yet? John Rivers finally couldn't hold back and shouted. Victor Sage withdrew the realm of no wind, causing goosebumps to rise all over John Rivers' body. Standing on this mountaintop, being exposed to the wind was far from a warm experience. Who are you? Where do you come from? Victor Sage finally asked the question that needed to be asked. Ethan Stone remained standing with his eyes shut, unmoving and silent. John Rivers curled himself into a ball and lay back in the crystal coffin to shield himself from the wind, clutching his shoulders as if shivering. In truth, his mind had already started working rapidly. It seemed he really had traveled to another world. The only question was, which era was this? It certainly wasn't the Qing dynasty. Neither of these two had the signature braided hairstyle of that time. Not being able to visit the 8 great hutongs was a bit of a pity, but the most pressing matter now was to figure out which era this was. After that, he needed to find a way to learn the martial arts these two possessed, so he could enjoy a carefree and adventurous life. Honestly, telling the truth wasn't a good idea. In novels, the protagonists never seem to tell the truth. That's right, being from another world, even if he did tell the truth, no one would believe him. Therefore, the golden moment for fabricating a story had arrived. John Rivers cleared his throat. I don't remember my name, nor where I'm from, and I certainly don't know why I've ended up here so unluckily. May I ask, esteemed masters, where exactly is this place? Yes, this was it, pretending to have amnesia. This way, all problems could be easily resolved. Following the usual storyline, the next step would be for these masters to see his extraordinary potential and then wholeheartedly train him, pinning their hopes on him, and so on. Damn it, the lucky day for our Rivers family has finally arrived. Victor Sage smiled faintly, clearly not believing John Rivers' words. Kid, do you know there's a technique called the soul-searching method? If you refuse to talk, this old Taoist wouldn't mind taking a look inside your head myself. But let me warn you, those subjected to the soul-searching method usually end up insane and forgetful. Do you really want to try? Beads of sweat formed on John Rivers' forehead. Right, they always talk about time travel, and it's said that ancient people had all sorts of bizarre techniques. If that damned soul-searching method really rummaged through his mind, wouldn't it be worse than death? His grand plan of being a heroic young master, surrounded by beauties, would crumble into dust. Does he really have to tell the truth? But. What the hell is this? Nothing is going according to logic. Chapter 4, Abandoning the Master. John Rivers was caught in a whirlwind of thoughts while Victor Sage, with a sinister smile, slowly approached. A Taoist with a lecherous grin advancing toward a trembling, naked man clutching his shoulders, this scene alone would make even the purest of minds conjure dirty thoughts. Just as John Rivers was about to spill the truth and let fate decide, Ethan Stone, who had been silent until now, finally opened his eyes and spoke. If he ends up becoming a fool, are you going to compensate me with a new disciple? Victor Sage froze for a moment. You want to take this kid as your disciple? I already told you, it's not the same, Ethan Stone replied. Victor Sage rolled up his sleeve. That gleaming gaze full of lies, successfully seizing a body, of course, it's not the same. Hearing that the stoic-faced man wanted to take him as a disciple, John Rivers couldn't help but snap his fingers inwardly. That's it, the story was finally getting on track. Seeing Ethan Stone remain silent, Victor Sage couldn't hold back and asked, "But this brat has already taken over this body. Are you planning to find another suitable one? After more than 10 years of hard training, would you so easily let this brat gain such an advantage? Didn't you always say that everything happens for a reason? If it's destiny, then I can only go along with it this time," Ethan Stone said, seemingly not disappointed but rather a bit relieved. Victor Sage snorted twice. "If you truly believe in destiny, why did you defy the heavens to ascend?" "Because I damn well felt like it," Ethan Stone shot back, leaving Victor Sage momentarily speechless. In his memory, Victor Sage couldn't recall Ethan Stone ever cursing. Ethan Stone waved at John Rivers, then turned and walked toward the cave nearby. John Rivers hastily stood up, covering his private parts with both hands, hunched over, and hurriedly followed. Victor Sage scratched his head from behind. Who would have thought that this old monster knows how to curse? Too bad he's still no match for my Taoist tongue. Damn it, the dead coming back to life, looks like I need to cast a divination. This new body isn't bad at all, John Rivers thought with satisfaction. Who would have imagined that after a lifetime of struggles and hardships, he'd stumble upon such incredible luck? Even though it's in another world, it's still somewhat meaningful, like finding a silver lining in the dark. Of course, he couldn't flaunt himself too much in front of familiar faces. People often say fortune doesn't strike twice, but here he was, gaining a new body on one side and having a master willing to pass down their legacy on the other. Such luck made John Rivers feel elated. This is what a truly remarkable life should be like. Ethan Stone led John Rivers into a mountain cave, sitting cross-legged on a protruding rock. His wooden expression remained unchanged, as if he were carefully sizing up John Rivers. At this moment, John Rivers felt as shy as a village girl attending her first matchmaking event. Being seen naked was inevitably embarrassing. He even secretly resolved that if this old man kept staring at him silently for another 3 minutes, he would definitely lose his temper in protest. "What's your name?" Ethan Stone's tone wasn't particularly gentle, but its calm and straightforward nature gave John Rivers a slight sense of reassurance. The name Rivers Iron Pillar was neither majestic nor aesthetically pleasing, so John Rivers scratched his head, uttered Rivers, and then paused, racking his brain to come up with a cooler name for himself. It's true what they say, you only regret not reading enough when you need it. Thinking of a satisfactory name in such a short time felt like an impossible task. Luckily, his awkward silence didn't last long. "I am Ethan Stone. If you wish to become my disciple, then I shall name you," Ethan Stone said in a calm tone that made John Rivers feel uneasy. Accepting this old man as his master was one thing, but if the name he gave turned out to be ridiculous, wouldn't his rebirth still leave him stuck with a lousy name? "He's Rivers, and you're Stone. Since he's your disciple, let's just call him John Rivers," Victor Sage casually decided from the cave entrance, speaking on Ethan Stone's behalf. Ethan Stone glanced at him. "You're quite talkative today, aren't you?" Victor Sage crossed his arms behind his back, rolling his eyes as he said, "You seem to be in an unusually good mood today. Even after losing the cauldron, you remain so calm. Looking at you now, you do have a bit of that immortal demeanor." John Rivers sat with his legs closed, hands covering his lower body, a posture that was neither dignified nor comfortable. Inwardly, he cursed the two old men, wondering if they couldn't see his current predicament. Couldn't they find him some clothes before starting their pointless chatter? "John Rivers, are you willing to take me as your master?" Ethan Stone seemed to accept the name Victor Sage had given to John Rivers. After asking this question, Victor Sage's face appeared rather smug. Clearing his throat, the man now called John Rivers grimaced and asked, "Even if a disciple ceremony doesn't require bathing or changing clothes, isn't it a bit too disrespectful to do it completely naked?" Ethan Stone waved dismissively, "I am not some orthodox scholar, and you are not a disciple from a family of scholars. Why bother with formalities? If you're willing, then bow." If not, his gaze suddenly shifted to Victor Sage. Surely, the old Taoist here has a way to turn this cauldron into a living, breathing person again, right? Ethan Stone asked nonchalantly. Victor Sage nodded repeatedly, his eyes lighting up, clearly eager to showcase his abilities. Before one could even blink, as soon as Ethan Stone finished speaking, John Rivers had already dropped to the ground, or rather, prostrated himself completely. He kowtowed 3 times loudly and reverently, shouting, "Master, your disciple pays his respects." The words were spoken with remarkable speed and clarity. Victor Sage scratched his ear. This kid really knows how to adapt. A bit shameless, perhaps, but at least he's not a fool. John Rivers lay flat on the ground, cursing inwardly. If I don't agree, won't this cunning Taoist just kill me? Thinking it over, becoming a disciple of a great master was already my plan, so why not go with the flow? Only a fool would keep arguing about whether or not to wear clothes. Ethan Stone glanced at John Rivers kneeling before him and nodded. Suddenly, he noticed that because John Rivers was kneeling with his head down, his large, dark backside was sticking up prominently, catching his attention. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. After all these years of roaming the world, who would have thought that when taking in a disciple, he'd be distracted by said disciple's backside? Victor Sage unceremoniously kicked John Rivers in the rear. John let out a yelp and turned to glare at him, but then, remembering that this Taoist was an acquaintance of his master, a highly skilled individual, he quickly plastered on a flattering smile. Although I'm taking you as my disciple, unfortunately, I won't be able to teach you much, Ethan Stone said, signaling John Rivers to stand up. Lying down wasn't comfortable, but it was better than standing while constantly having to cover up his embarrassing state. So, John decided to stay as he was. Hearing Ethan's words, John Rivers was almost ready to curse aloud. A master who doesn't teach his disciple? Then what's the point of having a master? Does this mean I'll only carry the title of disciple without learning any advanced skills? Could this old man be planning to take advantage of me for some sinister purpose? No, surely not, he's a great master, after all. How could he stoop so low? John tried to reassure himself. But then again, great masters are often eccentric. Otherwise, how would they live up to the title of great? So, John maintained his smile, raised his head, and listened carefully. However, Ethan Stone suddenly stopped talking and looked up at Victor Sage without saying a word. John Rivers was left dumbfounded. Could this great master be a little unhinged? Are you telling me to speak? Victor Sage asked, equally baffled. Ethan Stone continued to stare at him silently. Damn it. You've spent your whole life pretending to be the silent type, and now you want me, an old Taoist, to do the talking even when taking in a disciple? What kind of logic is that? Victor Sage started jumping in frustration. Forget it. Don't even think about it. I'm not wasting my breath. If you want to say something, say it yourself. But no matter how much Victor Sage yelled, Ethan Stone's silence ultimately prevailed. Ethan Stone closed his eyes again, the #1 master of the continent adopting a posture that seemed like meditation, but looked even more like he was asleep. Master? John Rivers called out hesitantly. Victor Sage responded with a grumble of annoyance, walked over to John Rivers, and sat down in front of him. After a moment, he sensed something was off, thought for a bit, and finally took off his old robe and tossed it to John Rivers. At last, there was no need to expose his youthful form anymore. Overjoyed, John Rivers quickly put on the robe, tightened the belt, and let out a sigh of relief. Though the clothing was a bit shabby, it was at least warm. Glancing at Ethan Stone, who was deep in meditation, Victor Sage muttered a few words under his breath. He adjusted his inner garment with his hands, then suddenly, as if realizing something, began rummaging inside his clothes. Based on nearly 30 years of life experience, John Rivers guessed that this old Taoist seemed to be searching for some kind of parasite, perhaps lice or fleas. Thinking this, he suddenly felt itchy all over himself, but didn't dare to scratch indiscriminately, fearing it would be impolite. Instead, he reassured himself that it was all in his mind. The Taoist robe he was wearing was clean, very clean. Victor Sage searched for a long time but, unfortunately, couldn't find any tiny creature that might have been causing his itch. With a dissatisfied shrug, he gave up. Many years later, whenever Victor Sage came to mind, John Rivers always remembered the scene in that mountain cave, two people sitting side by side, with Ethan Stone nearby, as still as a wooden or earthen statue. When John Rivers set foot on the continent, these two were the first people he encountered and, naturally, the two who had the greatest influence on him. As for the cave atop the desolate mountain, it undoubtedly became a place of profound significance for John Rivers. Victor Sage had a gift for eloquence and a sharp mind. Ethan Stone chose him to enlighten his disciple, a decision that proved to be absolutely right. To teach a disciple, one must first help them understand the world they live in. John Rivers claimed to have lost his memory, so the two masters treated him as if he truly had, forgetting not only his name, origins, and homeland but even his lineage. In this way, John Rivers was like a blank sheet of paper, requiring explanations and teachings about everything on the continent. This was something Ethan Stone couldn't do, but Victor Sage was perfectly suited for it. #### Chapter 5, The Rise and Fall of Glory. Moreover, very quickly, Victor Sage, who initially felt a bit dissatisfied, entered the zone. This was because John Rivers was an exceptionally attentive listener, asking questions at the right moments or offering a few interpretations. When the explanation turned into a conversation, Victor Sage's enthusiasm soared immediately, even to the point of excitement. The world John Rivers arrived in was a continent. This is not redundant to say, because this land resembled an enormous island, floating amidst an endless ocean. The desire to conquer and explore the seas is universal across all worlds. Great explorers had countless times raised their sails to venture into the ocean, their courage and passion boiling over, eager to reach the other side, longing for the silhouette of a new continent. Though these dreams were inspiring and beautiful, reality often revealed a cruel face. Aside from a few adventurers who managed to return alive, the vast majority never came back. Even with sturdy ships, abundant food supplies, and crews that included many warriors and mages, there was no guarantee that the harbor would welcome their return with the sound of triumphant horns. Raging storms and man-eating sea beasts, creatures from the darkest nightmares, awaited them. Even if they could overcome these perils, food and fresh water were ultimately finite. When these essential supplies were halfway depleted, even the most resolute captain could only give the order to turn back. After countless lives were lost beneath the waves, even the most stubborn individuals had no choice but to admit that the ocean was boundless, and the continent they lived on might very well be the only one. Yet, these sacrifices were not without results. At the very least, the maps of the seas expanded continuously until one day, no sailor had the idea, the ability, or the faith to extend them further. At this point, the map of the continent revealed a shape that resembled a fried egg with a bite taken out of it. The yolk, of course, represented the continent, while the white symbolized the mapped seas. And why did it look like a bitten fried egg? Naturally, there was a reason. The brave explorers not only ventured across the continent but also attempted to navigate the ocean in every direction. However, the lands and seas of the north remained an unknown realm to everyone. The north was the territory of the frozen desolation kingdom. This was merely how the people of the continent described it for political purposes. In reality, no one truly knows how vast the northernmost land is. Based on cautious estimates, the territory of the frozen desolation kingdom actually occupies less than one-third of the northernmost land. It's not that the tundra warriors lack the spirit of exploration, but the farther north one ventures, the more challenges arise, not only the extreme cold capable of freezing blood but also countless unnamed ferocious beasts roaming the area. Everyone knows that animals in frigid climates tend to have larger bodies. For instance, the size of tundra wolves is nearly twice that of wolves from other regions. Harsh weather and bloodthirsty beasts have deterred the steps of many adventurers. Therefore, although the continent itself resembles a massive circular disc, a significant portion is inevitably missing from maps. This disc-like shape might also be one of the origins of the continent's first name, Golden Plate Continent. However, a more plausible reason could be that the first dynasty to unify the continent was the Alexander dynasty, as the founding emperor of the Alexander dynasty bore a rather ordinary name. The emperor's name was Alexander King. Although the name might not align with the heroic element, Alexander King, with his origins as a wandering knight, managed to unify the continent in less than 30 years. He named both his dynasty and the conquered continent after himself, which in itself was an extraordinary achievement. Heroes shape the times, and the times shape heroes. Alexander King's success in unifying the continent was closely tied to the power dynamics at play during that era. At the time, no kingdom had fully formed. The vast land was scattered with city-states and tribes of various sizes. Thus, when Alexander King began his campaign with a cavalry force of fewer than 10,000, his influence quickly snowballed like an avalanche. In reality, the territory Alexander's dynasty conquered by force accounted for less than half of the continent. The remaining forces chose to submit entirely. While this method of unification was highly efficient, its weakness lay in its lack of stability. Perhaps this was also the reason behind the eventual downfall of the Alexander dynasty. Ambitious as he was, Alexander King established the continent's first empire. The empire was so vast that it took months for an envoy to travel from Golden Capital City at the center of the continent to its borders, even when riding tirelessly with minimal rest. When Victor Sage recounted this story, John Rivers couldn't help but feel a surge of passion. For a true man to wield a 3-foot sword and achieve unparalleled feats, that was the shared dream of men. Naturally, John Rivers, being a man, admired and yearned for such glory. Ruling such a vast empire required not only unparalleled martial prowess, but also extraordinary intelligence. Alexander King's strength and intellect may have far surpassed ordinary people, yet governing such an expansive land proved to be beyond his capabilities. In the 23rd year of the Alexander dynasty, a minor conflict broke out between two tribes in the west. This was somewhat understandable, as both tribes had populations of less than 30,000. Meaning their number of warriors was limited. However, the cause of the conflict was almost laughable. A hunter from the Shield tribe killed a tiger. While inspecting his prize, he discovered another arrow embedded in the tiger's body. Subsequently, a warrior from the 8 tribe stepped forward, claiming that he had shot the tiger first and thus had rightful ownership of the prey. Naturally, the hero of the Shield tribe refused to accept such an unreasonable demand. As a result, the two decided to resolve the dispute using the simplest, most primitive, and most effective method to determine ownership of the prey. However, for some other reasons, this duel was to be fought without weapons and without the intention of killing the opponent. Next came the hero of the Shield tribe, his face battered and bruised, but gleefully dragging back his victorious prey. Meanwhile, the warrior of the 8 tribe returned home with several broken ribs. Along the way, he didn't forget to pick a few medicinal herbs to apply externally and consume internally for healing. Unfortunately, this warrior not only failed to deliver a decisive arrow in hunting, but his fists also lacked the strength for a critical blow in combat. Even his knowledge of medicinal herbs was quite lacking. No one knows which herb ultimately sealed his fate, but not long after returning home, the warrior stretched out his legs and joined the spirit of the tiger in the afterlife. Perhaps in the realm of spirits, he might become a skilled hunter. However, dying from poisoning is far from honorable for a warrior, especially when it's self-inflicted. Such a shameful death was unacceptable to his tribe. The solution was simple: tarnish the reputation of the hero from the Shield tribe. They accused the tiger-slaying hero of using poison during the duel. Whether poison could be hidden in bare fists during an unarmed fight was clearly not a concern for the elders of the 8 tribe. Thus, verbal accusations escalated into a brawl involving thousands. Rumor has it that hundreds of warriors from both sides lost their lives proving their bravery, with even more suffering injuries. For the Alexander Empire, with a population exceeding 2 billion, the deaths of a few hundred people were hardly significant. However, for the two tribes that had both suffered losses, the distant Qing kingdom could not step in to impartially mediate their dispute, at least not to deliver a reasonable judgment immediately. As a result, the war not only continued but also expanded further. Both tribes invited their allies to join this war of honor, and as the conflict spread, city-states that already harbored animosity towards each other began using this situation as an excuse to form factions and seek vengeance. A small spark eventually grew into a raging inferno. Emperor Alexander Qing, in a fit of fury, decided to employ iron-fisted measures to remind the mindless factions who truly held ultimate power. The army began assembling rapidly. Yet, the aging emperor ultimately never had the chance to wield his royal sword again. In the 24th year of Alexander's reign, at the age of 79, Emperor Alexander Qing passed away in his palace. Before his death, he bestowed the royal sword, a symbol of authority, upon Crown Prince Edward Qing. By this point, a significant portion of the army had already gathered near Golden Capital City. News of the emperor's sudden demise left the generals, who were brimming with zeal for a major battle, momentarily stunned. The newly ascended crown prince barely had time to celebrate his rise to power before his discontented younger brothers began plotting rebellion, even treason. These princes were clearly too hasty. After all, the crown prince held overwhelming military power, with the Qing kingdom's royal guards and a large contingent of troops outside the capital pledging loyalty to him. Thus, the bloodshed from the internal palace struggle was quickly cleaned up. The newly crowned emperor basked in his triumph, pushing the tribal war in the distant lands to the back of his mind, as if unaware of how devastating that seemingly insignificant conflict could become. He also failed to realize that his true adversaries were not his pampered younger brothers. In the autumn of the 24th year of Alexander's reign, Emperor Edward Qing, in the prime of his life and brimming with grand ambitions, suddenly fell gravely ill. Before he could even decide which son would inherit the throne, he passed away. Reigning for 14 days, executing two princes who plotted to seize the throne, placing his other brothers under house arrest, and planning the selection of concubines, these were all the accomplishments of the new emperor, Edward Qing. Clearly, he had not done enough, nor had he done it well. Edward Qing died in great resentment. Anyone with a sharp mind knew that this emperor had fallen victim to a conspiracy. However, royal authority is not invincible. As long as one possesses immense power, the so-called majesty of the royal family is nothing more than a dull joke. The unfortunate emperor did not have the chance to designate an heir before his death. In truth, the matter of succession was no longer Edward Qing's concern. On the very day of his passing, Imperial Marshal William Carter suddenly declared that the new Emperor Edward Qing was cruel and inhumane, guilty of fratricide, and thus proved that the Qing family had decayed. For the welfare of the empire's people, this righteous marshal decided to end the Alexander dynasty's reign. Although this justification seemed somewhat flimsy, and the so-called welfare of the people, weren't they always the ones oppressed by the rulers and nobility? Usurping the throne might be shameful, but William Carter had his own compelling reasons for doing so. Chapter 6, The Rise of the Great Wind. Right before Edward Qing passed away, the forces across the continent began to stir. Subdued by threats, yet when the power of those threats weakens, any ambitious ruler would hardly be willing to remain submissive under someone else's rule. Thus, after news of the emperor's death spread, the fragmentation of the empire became inevitable. William Carter keenly recognized this and, as a marshal commanding a significant military force, knew he could not prevent it from happening. Therefore, he seized the opportunity first. Edward Qing had only been on the throne for a few months, not even long enough to change the decrees of his predecessor, nor to indulge in extravagance. How could he have committed any acts of cruelty or tyranny? As for the fratricide, it was merely a necessary act to consolidate royal power, something that any king might have done, and was not excessively unjust. William Carter also understood that his accusations were baseless. Initially, he did not expect many to believe the slanders he spread. However, with hundreds of thousands of loyal troops under his command, this military might could easily compel people to believe whatever they were made to believe. The bloodline of Alexander King was, of course, not mere lambs to be slaughtered. Though they knew the situation was irreversible, these princes still fought with all their might, defying the odds, using any means they could think of to suppress the traitor. Golden Capital City turned into a river of blood. Yet William Carter remained untainted, his battle robe bore not a single drop of blood. Although the massacre of the entire King bloodline depended entirely on him, he did not have time for guilt, or rather, there was no reason to feel guilty. The composed marshal easily maintained the power and glory he had achieved. The Alexander dynasty ruled for 24 years. In the final winter of its reign, William Carter announced the establishment of the heavenly capital kingdom and naturally became its first emperor. The snow that year seemed particularly heavy, the cold seeping effortlessly into human bones, yet it could not freeze the ambitions of a conqueror. By the following autumn, the 100 Battles declared its founding. While William Carter was preoccupied with stabilizing internal affairs, he was forced to confront his first challenger, a force daring enough to oppose him. 200,000 elite soldiers of the Heavenly Capital Army crushed the autumn winds as they marched directly toward 100 Battles. Unlike the Heavenly Capital Kingdom, the 100 Battles was entirely a blood-soaked nation born out of war and conquest. Meanwhile, the Heavenly Capital Kingdom experienced no large-scale rebellions after its establishment, a testament to the strong governance of the Alexander dynasty in the central region, as well as William Carter's extraordinary leadership. The newly formed 100 Battles had barely wiped the blood off its blades, before facing an even stronger enemy. In terms of both military strength and financial resources, the fledgling 100 Battles was like a youth wielding a wooden sword compared to the giant that was the Heavenly Capital Kingdom. The outcome of the war seemed predetermined. Even the citizens and soldiers of the 100 Battles Kingdom were pessimistic, unable to comprehend why their bold and prideful new emperor dared to challenge the Heavenly Capital Kingdom so fiercely. It wasn't long before they understood the reason. As the grand army of the Heavenly Capital Kingdom approached the territory of 100 Battles, the warriors of 100 Battles prepared to fight to the death. Meanwhile, in the south, the Shangguan clan, the leading family, declared its authority over its controlled region, officially establishing the Virtuous Waters Kingdom. Thus, the young man who dared to challenge the giant gained a new companion. Together, they stood fearlessly before the mighty Heavenly Capital Kingdom, determined to protect their freedom and independence at all costs. While William Carter furrowed his brows on the throne over the emergence of this new adversary, the Snowfield tribe in the far north declared independence from any nation's rule, giving birth to the Frozen Desolation Kingdom. The timing of the Frozen Desolation Kingdom's independence was impeccable. In truth, even without the establishment of 100 Battles and Virtuous Waters, the Heavenly Capital Kingdom would have been reluctant to ignite a war for control over such a frigid and barren land. Facing the Snowfield warriors, known for their unparalleled individual strength, for such a desolate region was not a profitable venture. The situation seemed increasingly chaotic. While William Carter's usurpation of the throne faced little opposition, his ambition to forge a unified dominion akin to Alexander's dynasty appeared exceedingly challenging. At that moment, William Carter made a decision that baffled everyone. The West, known as the stronghold of Buddhism, became the focus. After William Carter's envoy visited the Nirvana temple, the contents of their secret meeting remained unknown. However, shortly thereafter, the military and administrative forces of the Alexander dynasty stationed in the west withdrew to the Heavenly Capital Kingdom. The abbot of Nirvana temple then proclaimed to his followers, "Buddha resides here, this is the Pure Land." As a result, a new nation emerged in the west, self-proclaimed as the Nirvana Kingdom, commonly referred to as the Buddhist Kingdom. Nirvana temple would reign as the dominant power of this nation. No one understood why William Carter, when faced with challenges, fostered a new rival. If it was for an alliance, the military strength of the Nirvana Kingdom was clearly not held in high regard. In the winter of the year 996 of the Continental Era, the mighty lions of the Heavenly Capital Kingdom finally clashed with the 100 Battles army. After countless battles, it was only fitting to call them 100 Battles. The Hundred Battles Kingdom was established amidst the flames of war, possessing remarkable combat capabilities. Facing the well-trained and disciplined army of the Heavenly Capital Kingdom, the soldiers of Hundred Battles showed no fear, shouting as they charged to attack the enemy. In truth, the so-called army of the Heavenly Capital Kingdom should be referred to as the elite troops of Alexander. Unfortunately, with the collapse of the Alexander dynasty, this mighty force had to adopt a new name. The resilience and bravery of Hundred Battles could not change their disadvantaged position. The Heavenly Capital Kingdom's army continuously secured victories, boosting morale as if determined to annex Hundred Battles into their territory. The containment strategy failed, forcing Virtuous Water's kingdom to take further action. Like lips and teeth dependent on each other, the cunning Shangguan clan naturally understood this obvious principle. As a result, the supply routes of the Heavenly Capital Kingdom's army were repeatedly disrupted and attacked. Meanwhile, within the Heavenly Capital Kingdom itself, merchants from Virtuous Waters relentlessly targeted the kingdom's economic lifeline through various means. No money, no war. Faced with growing domestic instability, William Carter was forced to compromise. From the moment the army withdrew, the Heavenly Capital Kingdom had, in essence, acknowledged the status of both Hundred Battles and Virtuous Waters. With Alexander's collapse, the structure of 5 coexisting nations finally took shape. Well then, John Rivers stroked his chin, everyone. I mean, which nation do we belong to? Hearing this, Victor Sage smirked with some pride. I am the national advisor of Heavenly Capital. You tell me, which nation do you think we belong to? And that guy over there. Gesturing toward Ethan Stone, who was meditating with his eyes closed, Victor Sage continued, the concept of nations holds no meaning for him. Of course, it makes sense, he's the #1 master on the continent. Naturally, he doesn't care which country he's from. The phrase #1 master on the continent made John Rivers' eyes light up. If his master was this amazing, wouldn't he get to bask in some of that glory too? His small, ambitious thoughts were easily seen through by Victor Sage, who sneered, just because your master is invincible doesn't mean the disciple is powerful. So, don't get too excited. Victor Sage poured cold water on his enthusiasm. John Rivers chuckled sheepishly, as long as I don't get bullied, I'm fine. I'm not planning to go around causing trouble or picking fights. Victor Sage tilted his head, don't you want to become a martial arts expert? John Rivers shook his head. A general leading tens of thousands of troops, commanding respect and awe? Victor Sage probed further. John Rivers shook his head again. Victor Sage rubbed his nose with his thumb, don't tell me you want to become some frail scholar? John Rivers shook his head more firmly. With no scholarly talent and no martial skills, what exactly do you plan to do? Victor Sage widened his eyes in curiosity. In his own world, during his free time, John Rivers would occasionally browse novels online. Though he rarely read them, he was aware that protagonists in these stories, after transmigrating or reincarnating, would often train relentlessly, level up, and eventually dominate the world, sometimes even surpassing human limitations. But John Rivers did not believe he had to follow the same path. No matter the world, the ultimate goal was to live happily. What was the point of burying oneself in grueling training, wasting one's youth in cultivation? Enjoying life, savoring every moment, this was the true essence of existence, not self-inflicted suffering. Thus, John Rivers' real thoughts were, learn a bit of basic self-defense, then use the unique advantages of being a transmigrator, knowledge beyond this era, to make a fortune, and, of course, indulge in wine and women, surrounded by beauty, living a life of pure pleasure. That was his true plan. After hesitating for a moment, when he selectively shared his thoughts, Victor Sage fell silent. Seeing Victor Sage's jaw drop in astonishment, John Rivers had the sudden urge to shove a light bulb into his mouth, though recalling the unbreakable rule that a light bulb could go in but not come out, he figured Victor Sage's gaping expression might truly collapse under such a scenario. You really have a bright future ahead of you, Victor Sage finally closed his mouth and sighed. John Rivers smiled with an indescribable air of humility, unaware that Victor Sage was desperately restraining himself from letting his fist bloom into a bloody flower on John Rivers' face. I am the national advisor, do you understand my status? Victor Sage tried to maintain his composure. John Rivers nodded. It was easy to understand, national advisor, after all, a prestigious position, a very cool figure. Pointing at Ethan Stone, I've told you, he's the #1 master on the continent. Did you hear that? Victor Sage's calm voice carried a barely perceptible tremor. John Rivers found it strange what this old Taoist was trying to convey, but he still nodded to show he understood Ethan Stone's status. Then the two fell silent. After a while, Victor Sage finally spoke up. So, are you an idiot? With two such great figures able to support you, you choose to be a wastrel, a debauched libertine flaunting your meat stick everywhere? Victor Sage's voice finally revealed his anger. John Rivers couldn't understand why this old Taoist was so upset. I choose the life I want, what's wrong with that? So, he hesitated and asked, then, what do you think I should do? Slapping his thigh, of course, you should become a legendary figure, renowned across the world. A disciple of Ethan Stone being a nobody? Wouldn't that make the #1 master a laughingstock? Even I would lose face. After all, this body was crafted by me, how can I let you waste it like this? Victor Sage was furious. Slowly cracking his neck, John Rivers raised an eyebrow. #### Chapter 7, Dialogue Between Two Worlds. Do you think I should do as you say? John Rivers tilted his head, asking with an air of indifference. Victor Sage wanted nothing more than to slap him, but as the royal advisor, he decided to maintain his composure, showing himself to be a man of refinement, provided, of course, that this brat didn't push him too far. A man cannot live an ordinary life. Especially someone like you, blessed with such innate talents. In terms of physical aptitude, who in this world could surpass you? And as for Old Stone's skills, who could claim they fall short? Useless fool. Victor Sage grew increasingly furious, his mustache practically bristling with rage. John Rivers, in truth, was a very stubborn person. Once he made up his mind, it was almost impossible to sway him, regardless of whether he was right or wrong. This was likely one of the key reasons why he struggled in his own world. He genuinely couldn't understand why having this body or finding a great mentor meant he was obligated to pursue some grand career. If you're good-looking, must you become an actor? If you sing well, are you destined to be a singer? What kind of logic is that? Initially, he had felt a bit intimidated by Victor Sage. After all, the man was a revered master, and John figured he might need to rely on him and another individual to survive in this world. A little respect wouldn't hurt. However, as Victor Sage's scolding continued, John Rivers grew angry. Who was this man to boss him around? Even his own father had never demanded he follow a specific path. Did sticking a wooden sword on your head automatically elevate your status? Without a word, John Rivers simply looked skyward, his demeanor exuding defiance. His carefree attitude seemed to scream at Victor Sage, "Go ahead and talk, I'm not listening." Victor Sage finally lost his temper. With a thunderous roar, he reached out toward John Rivers. The moment his hand moved, a strange, faintly discernible black aura seemed to swirl around it. John Rivers was startled. He hadn't expected the old man to resort to physical action. Instinctively, he tried to dodge the ominous hand reaching for him. If it had been his previous body, John Rivers would absolutely not have been able to avoid this grab. After all, the brain's consciousness requires a certain amount of time to translate into bodily actions. However, this new body clearly had quite good physical attributes. Just as the thought occurred to him, his head tilted to one side. It was a successful dodge, if you ignored the outcome. Tilting his head, John Rivers realized that whether he moved or not, it seemed irrelevant. Victor Sage's hand still aimed unerringly toward his face, without missing a millimeter. He no longer had the chance to dodge again, not even enough time to cry out. Perhaps this elder intended to kill him with one strike, Or maybe he wanted to use some sort of secret sorcerer spell to invade his mind. Either way, judging by the current situation, John Rivers' only option was to close his eyes and brace himself for whatever was about to happen. In reality, he didn't even have time to shut his eyes. Victor Sage's hand stopped right in front of John Rivers' face, less than a centimeter from the tip of his nose. John Rivers could feel the heat emanating from Victor Sage's palm. He didn't even dare to swallow his saliva, his gaze involuntarily fixed on the other's hand, completely unaware that he was making a ridiculous cross-eyed expression. "I'm not in a hurry, why are you so angry?" Ethan Stone opened his eyes, his strange question spoken without any discernible emotion, much like his indifferent expression. Victor Sage withdrew his hand in frustration. "You still want to save him? Something so useless should just be discarded. Though the cauldron spirit is no longer perfect, it's still better than nothing." He added, "I will find a way to ensure your soul transfer succeeds." Ethan Stone said nothing. John Rivers broke out in a cold sweat, awkwardly twisting his neck to turn his head, forcing a smile that looked worse than a grimace toward Ethan Stone. "So, you're not interested in inheriting my legacy?" Ethan Stone's voice was devoid of any tone, not cold but merely neutral, as if every word he spoke automatically erased all emotion. John Rivers quickly shook his head. "Of course, I hope to receive my master's teachings. It's just that I'm a very lazy person who only wants to live a comfortable life. Therefore, I'm afraid the matter of glorifying the sect would disappoint you, master." Victor Sage snorted coldly from the side, his murderous glare growing even sharper. "Being able to live the life you want is good enough," Ethan Stone lowered his gaze. "You can do as you please." The cold sweat on John Rivers' forehead had yet to be wiped away when he immediately dropped to his knees and kowtowed deeply. During his earlier apprenticeship ceremony, he had already performed the formal rites, but at that time, it felt like a reluctant act or a compromise for personal gain. This time, however, his bow was sincere and heartfelt. Although John Rivers didn't understand why some people were so determined to make a name for themselves and achieve fame, he did understand that for someone of Ethan Stone's status to allow his disciple the freedom to choose such a path was a rare occurrence, whether in this world or the one he originally came from. This is akin to Kim Jong-un's son refusing to take over his father's career, instead wanting to form a hip-hop band. No matter how well Kim Jong-un might have cultivated his son, he would likely set aside matters of nuclear weapons to focus on disciplining such an unfilial child. Victor Sage looked deeply disappointed. Disappointed as he was, he neither acted nor spoke further. He understood Ethan Stone's temperament well enough. Once a decision was made, there was no turning back. "Later, you'll come down the mountain with me. Before leaving, I'll take you on a trip for a while." Otherwise, Ethan Stone left the sentence unfinished. But John Rivers believed he meant to say, "Otherwise, I won't feel at ease." Though this thought lacked evidence, John Rivers stubbornly insisted that this was what Ethan Stone intended to convey. Victor Sage opened his mouth, but ultimately said nothing. He stood up, and the national advisor of Heavenly Capital Kingdom, dressed only in an inner robe and slippers, drifted gracefully down the mountain. If the citizens of Heavenly Capital saw the legendary, noble, and mysterious national advisor in such a state, they would undoubtedly be shocked. Fortunately, even most officials in the city had never seen Victor Sage's face. Thus, though this could have been an embarrassing moment for the Heavenly Capital Kingdom, it caused no significant harm. The Heavenly Capital Kingdom remained the continent's leading power, and its national advisor retained his status as a mysterious, powerful, and noble figure. Watching Victor Sage leave, John Rivers couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. This old Taoist might seem unrestrained and easygoing, but he was quicker to turn hostile than anyone else. Moments ago, they had been chatting amicably, yet the next moment, the old man was ready to push him into a deadly situation. Truly a third-degree scoundrel. As John Rivers pondered how such a Taoist could become the national advisor, he wondered if the entire Heavenly Capital Kingdom was full of such two-faced individuals. While silently cursing in his mind, John Rivers suddenly straightened up, remembering that someone else was still present, his master, Ethan Stone. Ethan Stone glanced at him casually, as though reading his thoughts. Don't resent him. Even if I hadn't stepped in earlier, the old Taoist wouldn't have truly harmed you. Though his temperament is a bit eccentric, he's genuinely a good person. Hearing this, John Rivers quickly nodded in agreement, though inwardly he muttered. He hadn't seen Ethan Stone intervene at all earlier. Could it be that this so-called master had reached a level of skill beyond comprehension? But Ethan Stone's next words struck him like a thunderclap on a clear day, leaving John Rivers drenched in sweat. Tell me, what is the world you came from like? Ethan Stone spoke slowly and calmly. John Rivers reluctantly suppressed his astonishment, raised his head, and tried to feign ignorance. His pretense shattered instantly. Ethan Stone's gaze bore into him, those eyes resembling a calm, still lake. Yet, under that gaze, John Rivers felt that any lie he told would seem utterly ridiculous. But Victor Sage didn't know he came from another world. How did Ethan Stone know? Ethan Stone silently observed John Rivers, waiting for an answer. Taking a deep breath, John Rivers finally spoke. That place is called Earth. The conversation with Victor Sage had already stretched on for quite some time, so by the time John finished introducing his world, the sky had truly grown dark. You all live on a star? A rare smile tugged at the corner of Ethan Stone's lips. How fascinating. Then, is our world also a massive sphere? John Rivers awkwardly shook his head. That's hard to say. That old sage mentioned earlier that no one on this continent has ever crossed the seas, so naturally, there's no way to know the full picture of this world. But judging by the natural environment, it doesn't seem vastly different from my world. During the day, there was sunlight. Now, outside, there were stars and a moon. He could breathe freely, so John Rivers felt this world wasn't much different from his own, except that the air here was much fresher. After hearing you, I'm even more curious about what lies beyond this sky, Ethan Stone murmured, staring intently at the night outside the cave entrance. John Rivers scratched his head. Truth be told, he quite liked his current hairstyle, shoulder-length hair. Back in his world, it would have been the look of an artsy young man or a rock singer. Judging from Ethan Stone and Victor Sage's appearances, people in this world seemed to all have long hair. Of course, this was just a guess. After all, these two were extraordinary individuals, and ordinary folks might not be the same. In our place, beyond the sky is the universe, filled with all kinds of stars. Some shine and spin, while others zip through space, colliding and shattering. John Rivers searched his mind for words. Many believe that beyond the sky lies infinity. Ethan Stone suddenly pointed to the ground. John Rivers followed his gesture and saw an ant crawling there. He silently marveled at how extraordinary Ethan Stone was, able to notice such a tiny creature in such dim light. Then he realized he could see it too. If it had been his old body, such a feat would have been impossible. Instantly, he felt a surge of joy. No wonder the old sage was so obsessed with this body, it truly was extraordinary. Watching the ant's antennae twitch endlessly as it scurried about, seemingly searching for something, Ethan Stone spoke slowly. Let us try using an example. Hashtag Chapter 8, Night of Heavenly Capital. Ethan Stone pointed at the ant on the ground. To it, this cave is enormous, and this mountain is even more colossal. So, wouldn't the entire continent seem infinite to it? But we all know that the entire continent has its boundaries. John Rivers understood Ethan Stone's point. The continent, compared to the ant, is like the world compared to humans. The ant believes this continent is infinite simply because it lacks the ability to explore it fully. In other words, Ethan Stone felt that the entire world is not truly infinite. That's why he wanted to see what lies beyond this sky. Is it, as John Rivers said, a silent void with floating celestial bodies? With a slightly bitter taste in his mouth, John Rivers spoke in a low voice. The environment of the universe is uninhabitable for living beings. So, even if we really take that step, it would hold no meaning. Ethan Stone shook his head. You're talking about matter, but at least in the world I once lived in, there was something beyond matter. John Rivers raised an eyebrow. Could it be that the people of this world had advanced to the point of uncovering the secrets of antimatter? It didn't seem very believable. Ethan Stone looked at him. I'm talking about the soul. John Rivers froze for a moment. Soul? Ghost? We believe that everything in existence has its own spirit. Even the pebbles on the ground possess an undeveloped essence. Therefore, the so-called environment you mentioned might affect the physical body, but it seems to have little effect on the soul. John Rivers felt his head ache slightly. As an atheist and a staunch skeptic of all religions, he naturally didn't believe in souls or anything supernatural. Hence, his reaction to Ethan Stone's words was, "Has my master gone mad?" Ethan Stone didn't offer further explanation. In the future, you will have the chance to witness it. Powerful practitioners can exist in this world in the form of a soul. For some inexplicable reason, John Rivers believed Ethan Stone's words. Deep down, he harbored immense trust in this extraordinary master, especially since the man had casually mentioned that John Rivers came from another world. Down the mountain. With these two simple words, Ethan Stone rose and walked out of the cave. Though it was just a casual phrase, it was clearly an order from a master. John Rivers obediently got up and followed. From now on, just call me teacher. Calling me master sounds a bit strange. Ethan Stone tossed out the remark without turning around. John Rivers was left speechless. He had assumed that in this era and world, addressing someone as master would be the norm. However, it seemed that wasn't the case. So, shamelessly, he asked why. Here, only monks call their mentors master. I'm not a monk, and I don't like monks either, Ethan Stone explained. John Rivers scratched his head. Indeed, he wasn't bald. John Rivers knew that the old master intended to take him down the mountain, but he had no idea about Ethan Stone's method of descent. They were on the mountaintop, and not far from the cave was a cliff. This very cliff had become John Rivers' first nightmare in this world. Standing by the cliff, John Rivers found it strange that he couldn't see a winding mountain path. Before his eyes could fully scan the mountaintop within a 10-jong radius, Ethan Stone had already grabbed his shoulder. Just as John Rivers was still in a daze, Ethan Stone leapt outward. It was a casual leap, except beneath them seemed to be an abyss thousands of feet deep. That night, the residents at the foot of Sacred Mountain seemed to hear an extremely piercing scream. Some timid individuals went to the mountain's base the next day to burn incense and pray, pleading with the mountain god to quell its inexplicable wrath. John Rivers' scream didn't last long, because he quickly realized his falling speed was very slow. At the very least, it didn't feel like he was being pulled straight to the ground by gravity, destined to become a splatter. Turning his head, he saw Ethan Stone still expressionless, but the hand gripping his shoulder seemed to be glued there, as if some force was binding them together as one. The first time bungee jumping, I couldn't grasp the master's brilliance, but next time it won't happen again, John Rivers said with a flattering smile. Although he had no idea what bungee jumping was, Ethan Stone clearly forgave his timid and clueless apprentice. At the foot of the mountain, John Rivers looked up. Though he didn't know exactly how tall this desolate mountain was, he noticed that what Ethan Stone called Sacred Mountain was evidently a massive cylindrical structure with irregular shapes. The base and the peak of the mountain were indistinguishable in size, essentially resembling a colossal stone pillar standing upright. This is the sacred mountain of the heavenly capital kingdom. Usually, when there's a major event requiring prayers or offerings to the heavens, the old priest climbs up here alone to perform his tricks, Ethan Stone explained. John Rivers particularly liked the word tricks, especially when used to describe that shabby old priest. But if he's the royal advisor, he must be highly respected. Wealth and luxury probably aren't a big deal for him, John Rivers thought, a tinge of envy rising in his heart. Drenched in riches, high status, and perhaps even beautiful women, no matter the world, these things always held a strong allure for men. Ethan Stone nodded slightly. Even the emperor has never set foot on this mountain. Just imagine how high the status of that old Taoist must be. John Rivers froze for a moment, then felt a surge of delight in his heart. Damn it, if even the emperor doesn't have the privilege to come here, yet I can freely go up and down as I please. I might as well do a striptease if I feel like it. Thinking about this, John Rivers felt that becoming a disciple wasn't a waste at all. With such a powerful master, wouldn't the entire continent be his playground? Not far from Sacred Mountain was the royal capital of the Heavenly Capital Kingdom. As the strongest nation on the continent, curfews were almost non-existent in the Heavenly Capital Kingdom, and the city gates were rarely closed. This was clearly a deliberate display of strength to the world, a gesture of confidence. The city gates remained open, welcoming everyone, whether they were commoners, merchants, spies, or assassins. The Heavenly Capital Kingdom simply didn't care. Because with great power, they could control everything. John Rivers followed Ethan Stone as they leisurely entered the royal capital of the Heavenly Capital Kingdom, carefully observing the capital of the continent's strongest nation. Although Ethan Stone could have easily avoided the inconvenience of walking, there was no need to flaunt his power in front of ordinary people. Moreover, walking at a relaxed pace allowed him to converse with John Rivers, so he refrained from using any special techniques. In truth, John Rivers secretly wished Ethan Stone would use rocket-like speed to take him into the city. Even if it meant ending up with a bizarre spiky hairstyle, he was more than willing to pay that price. Because John Rivers was, quite simply, very lazy. Of course, if the master intended to take a leisurely walk, as a disciple, he could only comply. The Heavenly Capital Kingdom was indeed prosperous, but for John Rivers, it might only hold a slightly different significance rather than leaving him utterly astonished. After all, as someone who had lived in another world, he naturally wouldn't react like some country bumpkin, gawking and exclaiming at everything new he saw. However, the first thing Ethan Stone did after entering the city made John Rivers extremely satisfied. That's because Ethan Stone first took him to a tailor shop. His long hair, swaying in the wind, was neatly tied into a sleek black bun. The old, worn-out robe he had been wearing was replaced with a perfectly fitting outfit, new from the inside out, including undergarments and socks. This made John Rivers feel as though he was being reborn as a person. From that moment on, he grew even fonder of this world. At least now, he wouldn't be scolded harshly by his superiors, nor would he return home to face his parents' reproach for being useless. Though being useless was a fact, John Rivers had an older brother and an older sister. Perhaps because they were born earlier, they had seized all the advantages. In any case, both of them were living far better lives than John Rivers. It was precisely this comparison that made John Rivers' parents look down even more on their youngest son. Although there's a saying that the youngest child or the family's heir is the most cherished, John Rivers had never felt that way. From a young age to adulthood, in every aspect, whether it was virtue, intellect, physical ability, beauty, or diligence, he always fell far behind his siblings. Because of this, losing the love and expectations of his parents was understandable. Regarding this, John Rivers didn't harbor much resentment. Although sometimes, at home, he felt like an extra, he never expressed these feelings outwardly. If he didn't take the initiative to reach out, neither his elder brother, second sister, nor his parents would bother to contact him, not even with a single phone call. Because of this, John Rivers occasionally wondered, could it be that he was an abandoned child picked up from a trash bin? Otherwise, why would his family treat him with such indifference? Even if he was useless, could that fact truly diminish the bonds of blood? He never found an answer to this question. But now, even though he addressed Ethan Stone as teacher outwardly, deep down, he wanted to call him master. A teacher is like a father. Of course, these were just thoughts. He still adhered to the rules here and respectfully referred to Ethan Stone as teacher. As for his daily needs, with clothing now taken care of, the next logical step was to satisfy his appetite. Great men are never stingy, and John Rivers firmly believed this. Ethan Stone, indeed, did not disappoint him. The finest tavern in Heavenly Capital was none other than the Left Intent Tavern. In John Rivers' opinion, the owner of this tavern was clearly trying to make a statement. Opening an artsy establishment in the capital of the most militarily powerful nation was obviously an attempt to stand out. Moreover, to become the largest tavern in the capital, the owner must have had good connections with high-ranking officials in the court. If someone claimed there was no collusion between business and politics, John Rivers would absolutely not believe it. Regardless, it was his first time in this world, his first time setting foot in the most powerful kingdom, and his first time sitting in the most renowned tavern in the capital. John Rivers immediately set aside all judgments, focusing solely on two things, eating and drinking. He was truly on the verge of starving. As a thoughtful mentor, Ethan Stone ordered 8 dishes. Moreover, judging by the ingredients, they were all expensive delicacies. For the 2 diners, this was undoubtedly a form of extravagance. John Rivers, naturally, would not let such luxury go to waste. He ate quickly, like a storm, and drank his wine in one gulp, even too lazy to use a bowl. In contrast, Ethan Stone was much more elegant, though he ate very little. John Rivers, on the other hand, ate as much as possible, the more, the better. Hashtag Chapter 9, The Continent of Cultivators. After feasting and drinking to their fill, it was naturally time to make some plans. However, when Ethan Stone asked about his future plans, John Rivers casually replied, "I'll leave everything to the mentor's discretion." Ethan Stone pressed his lips together. It was rare to find a disciple with such unparalleled talent, yet this one lacked ambition. That phrase, "I'll leave it to the mentor," didn't sound very reliable. After giving it some thought, Ethan Stone decided the best course of action was to take him around to explore, treating it as a journey. They found an inn to rest for the night, and the next day, Ethan Stone led John Rivers on the start of a long journey. Given John Rivers' temperament, traveling thousands of miles wasn't impossible, but relying solely on their feet was absolutely out of the question. Thus, Ethan Stone had no choice but to purchase 2 fine horses for the journey. John Rivers had never ridden a horse before. Now elevated to the status of a rider, he was exceedingly excited. However, his poor riding skills proved to be a challenge. The spirited steed seemed to disdain its new master, ignoring his commands. In the end, John Rivers had to let go of the reins, allowing the horse to leisurely follow behind Ethan Stone's mount. Unable to gallop at full speed, John Rivers felt a bit frustrated. After all, in novels, the great heroes always rode their horses at lightning speed, exuding an air of grandeur. In his case, it felt more like he was riding a donkey, slow and unimpressive. Watching Ethan Stone's 2 horses obediently follow their master, John Rivers couldn't help but sigh. A true master is indeed a master, both man and beast submit to them. Without a specific route in mind, Ethan Stone simply led John Rivers to wander aimlessly. When they were hungry, they ate, when they were tired, they rested. This leisurely journey not only allowed John Rivers to gain a deeper understanding of the world, but also provided a great opportunity to relax his mind. However, there was one thing: Ethan Stone had begun to train his disciple. As the #1 master in the world, Ethan Stone's teaching methods were rather unconventional. He didn't make John Rivers run 5 kilometers every day or do 300 push-ups. In short, such physical training routines were not part of his considerations. Instead, for a few hours each year, he would instruct John Rivers to close his eyes, as it was an essential part of the cultivation process. A very important part. At first, John Rivers couldn't understand this. If it were meditation or energy circulation, closing his eyes made sense. But Ethan Stone required him to close his eyes at any given moment. For example, while eating or even while dozing off on horseback. John Rivers found it extremely painful, and closing his eyes only made it worse. This training session began on a sunny morning. Judging by the weather, John Rivers could never have imagined that this would turn out to be a disastrous day for him. That day, John Rivers had just woken up, groggily stumbling down from the 2nd floor of the inn. He planned to order some delicious breakfast to fill his stomach. But as he reached the ground floor, he noticed Ethan Stone already sitting there. Hastily grabbing a few bites, John Rivers suddenly remembered to greet his master with a "good morning. As my disciple, it is my responsibility to teach you." If that's the case, let us start today, Ethan Stone said. Actually, John Rivers always felt awkward with the master-disciple way of addressing each other. To him, a teacher should go with a student, while a master should go with a disciple. However, to adapt to local customs, he had to adjust to this as well. Hearing Ethan Stone was about to teach him some skills, John Rivers felt a bit excited. All this time, though he hadn't voiced it, he had always wanted to ask his master when they would begin his training. Although he didn't have ambitions of dominating the world, learning powerful martial arts and techniques was still a tempting prospect. Even if it was just for self-defense or impressing girls, it wouldn't be a bad choice. And so, after breakfast, the master and disciple continued their journey. Along the way, Ethan Stone began trying to do what a teacher should do. After all, he was new to the role of taking on a disciple, so he could only fumble his way through it. "How much do you know about cultivators?" the master asked the first question. After traveling with Ethan Stone for nearly a month, John Rivers had gained a fair understanding of this world. He knew that people like Ethan Stone were referred to as cultivators, but it was only a vague concept to him. He wasn't clear on the strict classifications among cultivators. Seeing the confused and uncertain expression on John Rivers' face, Ethan Stone was quite satisfied. At the very least, this showed there was room for him to guide and enlighten his disciple. Moreover, what he appreciated most about John Rivers, aside from his perfectly crafted body by two individuals, was his true identity. Coming from another world, John Rivers was almost like a blank slate in this one. Because of that, he was unlike ordinary people. And what Ethan Stone desired was precisely a unique disciple. Leaving the town, the surroundings were covered with barley fields, and towering ancient trees lined both sides of the main road, standing as silent witnesses of time, perfectly embodying the long history of this kingdom. On that gently shaded path, Ethan Stone opened the door to the path of cultivation for John Rivers for the first time. On the continent, after nearly 1,000 years of evolution, practitioners could generally be categorized into 4 types: martial artists, mages, sorcerers, and formation masters. As Ethan Stone began his explanation, John Rivers immediately had a question. "I can easily understand what a martial artist is, but aren't mages and sorcerers the same? Magic is magic, can it really be divided into separate categories?" John Rivers inquired earnestly. Ethan Stone continued, "What we call martial artists, like myself, are those who, through martial cultivation, enhance their own. Master, you still haven't answered my question," John Rivers persistently interrupted Ethan Stone. Without turning back, Ethan Stone replied, "If you could wait for me to finish speaking before deciding whether to ask such questions, both of us would feel much more at ease." John Rivers closed his mouth and silently became a listener. Martial artists, as the name suggests, are those who practice martial arts. Whether they are guards with some combat skills, wandering performers with a bit of kung fu selling their strength-enhancing elixirs, or even muscular thugs who are hard for 7 or 8 people to approach, they all fall under the category of martial artists. Though they are considered the lowest tier. Sorcerers are slightly more complex. First and foremost, not everyone can become a sorcerer. This differs from martial artists, as anyone with functioning limbs, the ability to run and jump, regardless of how poor their aptitude may be, can be considered a martial artist. However, the requirements for sorcerers are much stricter. Due to this high threshold, sorcerers are far fewer in number compared to martial artists across the continent. Those with innate talent, after undergoing rigorous training, can control the rules and forces of nature to a certain extent, for instance, conjuring fire out of thin air or summoning lightning on flat ground. This power is achieved by resonating with the world, allowing them to borrow the forces of nature. Of course, novice sorcerers cannot possibly have the capabilities to conjure fire or summon lightning. Sorcerers are also referred to as cursed sorcerers, and the reason is simple. For those whose innate talent is insufficient to become a sorcerer, there exists an alternative path, becoming a cursed sorcerer. Due to their limited aptitude, some individuals unable to become sorcerers, but unwilling to settle for being muscular martial artists have carved out another path of cultivation. They rely on potions and secret techniques to forcibly alter their physical attributes, thereby gaining power. This is an extremely arduous choice. However, unlike sorcerers, cursed sorcerers do not borrow the forces of nature. Instead, they steal, forcibly manipulate, and alter the natural laws. This is also why casting spells as a cursed sorcerer often results in backlash. Naturally, because of this characteristic, cursed sorcerers have earned their infamous title, cursed sorcerers. Possessing magical powers akin to sorcerers, but enduring far greater suffering, that is the essence of a cursed sorcerer. Compared to the three aforementioned paths, the requirements for formation masters are entirely different. They do not need a strong physique, extraordinary innate talent, or the tedious work of tending a furnace day in and day out. However, while only one condition is required, it is by no means easy to fulfill. Formation masters require extraordinary sensory perception. For example, in complete darkness, a formation master can rely on their sensory abilities to detect how many people are within a certain range and even determine what actions these individuals are performing. Regarding this sensory perception ability, even the most arrogant mage cannot deny being a step below a formation master. The place where formation masters are most commonly found is typically the military. Whether it's arranging troops or setting up defensive camps, having the assistance of a formation master undoubtedly provides significant support. For instance, formations set up by a formation master can cause enemy troops to lose their way during a nighttime ambush, akin to encountering a ghostly wall, endlessly circling in place. They can also create offensive arrays during an attack. As long as the attacking army's formation doesn't undergo drastic changes, it can significantly enhance combat power. However, among the four types of cultivators, formation masters are the rarest. Perhaps this is because, without prior preparation, formation masters are the weakest in combat among the four types. Another possibility is that not many people wish to limit their potential within the confines of the military. Master, isn't it said that you're the #1 expert on the continent? But as a martial artist, is it truly possible to achieve such great accomplishments? Or is it that you're only the best among martial artists? John Rivers cautiously voiced his question, clearly not wanting Ethan Stone to take offense. Why do you think a martial artist cannot stand at the pinnacle? Ethan Stone countered. John Rivers sighed, isn't it obvious? Mages can harness the power of nature, and sorcerers can even break some of this world's rules. Compared to martial artists, who only train in physical techniques, they seem much stronger. Can a martial artist possibly withstand the lightning summoned by a mage? If you can't block it, you can dodge it. If you can't dodge it, you can endure it. Just based on this, how can you say martial artists are inferior to mages? Ethan Stone replied calmly, showing no anger. John Rivers imagined a martial artist enduring a lightning strike and couldn't help but shudder. Rationally, he decided that if it were him, he would absolutely never choose such a method. There are countless ways to die, getting struck by lightning need not be one of them. There's no such thing as absolute strength in this world, everything depends on individual cultivation. Take me as an example. It's safe to say that in front of me, there are very few mages on this continent who would even have the chance to summon that deadly lightning, Ethan Stone said indifferently. These words were incredibly arrogant, but John Rivers believed them. #####Chapter 10, Every grain of rice is precious. However, despite believing it, John Rivers immediately felt a silent resentment toward Ethan Stone's words. Pursing his lips, John Rivers thought to himself, of course, the elder is different, being the #1 master and all, but if it were me, I doubt many mages could even cast a lightning bolt before I took their life. If you wish to become a mage, I can also find someone suitable to teach you. Seeing John Rivers remain silent, Ethan Stone spoke up. This was a temptation. Being able to use fireballs and lightning as weapons, John Rivers, as a longtime online gamer, found it extremely tempting. Such skills, both visually stunning and powerful, were excellent for both performance and real combat. Yet John Rivers took only a second to reject this temptation. Having already accepted Ethan Stone as his master, he felt he should embrace his master's identity and methods. It wasn't necessarily about respecting the teacher-student bond, but simply because John Rivers felt he couldn't dismiss Ethan Stone's efforts just for his own curiosity. Thus, he immediately spoke words like "once a teacher, always a father," expressing his willingness to focus solely on martial arts from now on, making the listener feel quite pleased. Although Ethan Stone's face didn't show it, he was genuinely delighted in his heart. At a certain level, there might not be much difference between disciplines, Ethan Stone said, his words sounding somewhat like consolation. Calmly accepting the consolation, John Rivers posed a new question: if it's all about cultivation, couldn't one pursue both at the same time? For instance, if someone had extraordinary talent, couldn't they be both a martial artist and a mage, and even dabble in formations for fun when interested? Ethan Stone countered with a question: do you think everyone in this world is a fool? John Rivers, of course, did not dare to say it outright, as doing so would be akin to insulting his master. Moreover, from any perspective, the people of this world did not exhibit signs of inferior intelligence. What you've thought of, do you think others wouldn't have considered it as well? Ethan Stone maintained his calm tone. If you only look at the basics, these cultivation paths don't differ too much. But once you reach the initiation stage, the distinctions become increasingly clear. Crossing those boundaries is nearly impossible. Ethan Stone patiently explained. John Rivers scratched his head. So, these professions could only progress in a straight line. Finding an NPC to change careers wasn't an option, it didn't sound exciting at all. In John Rivers' mind, with such a perfect body, why not cultivate martial arts, magic, techniques, and formations all at once? Wouldn't that shake the heavens and earth and make him undeniably cool? Ethan Stone's words shattered John Rivers' dream. However, he didn't feel disappointed, as those thoughts were merely fleeting. If he truly had to spend every day solely cultivating, he'd rather hang himself with a strand of hair. He was here to enjoy life, enjoyment was the fundamental principle. John Rivers remained steadfast in his mindset. After briefly explaining, Ethan Stone officially began teaching his disciple. At first, John Rivers spent 2 hours each day with his eyes closed. Of course, it wasn't for sleeping. This time spent with his eyes shut entirely depended on Ethan Stone's mood. It could be during a meal or while swaying on horseback. Of course, simply making John Rivers eat rice and ride a horse with his eyes closed would be too childish and would fail to demonstrate Ethan Stone's profound skills. Therefore, when John Rivers ate rice with his eyes closed, Ethan Stone would suddenly use his chopsticks to pick up a grain of rice and casually flick it at any part of John Rivers' body. The grain of rice was very soft, delicious to eat, and naturally harmless when used to strike someone. Even if it were an uncooked grain, the pain it could cause would be limited. That's the logic, but it all depends on who is launching the grain of rice. Even a piece of freshly made tofu, in Ethan Stone's hands, could become a weapon capable of shattering stone. A grain of rice was merely one type of hidden weapon: wildflowers picked along the roadside, leaves casually plucked from trees, essentially all insignificant and unremarkable items, could be transformed into instruments of torment for John Rivers. John Rivers' body began to show red, swollen, and bruised marks, leaving him in constant, unspeakable misery. That said, this was John Rivers. If it were an ordinary person, leaves might cut their skin, and grains of rice could pierce their bones. Ethan Stone clearly understood the robustness of John Rivers' body. After all, it was the result of the brothers' painstaking efforts over more than a decade, so he wasn't concerned about accidentally causing a fatal incident. Many times, John Rivers couldn't help but open his eyes, refusing to continue this inhumane training method. However, Ethan Stone's response to his resistance was simply silence, not even bothering to lift an eyelid. What followed, however, was a rapid heartbeat, every hair on John Rivers' body standing on end, and a sensation akin to suddenly falling into an icy abyss. But this coldness wasn't simple, it not only tormented the body but also brought the spirit to the brink of collapse. Even without thinking, John Rivers knew it was his master punishing him for disobedience. Though he didn't know what method Ethan Stone used, this life-threatening aura was undoubtedly more intimidating than the so-called death glare. At most, John Rivers could endure 3 minutes under this aura. Drenched in sweat and pale-faced, he would close his eyes again, and Ethan Stone would withdraw the oppressive aura. The master and disciple duo would then resume their peculiar training game of please close your eyes. A few days later, unable to endure it any longer, John Rivers had no choice but to kneel on the ground and beg. He truly knelt with both knees down. His attitude was sincere, his gestures respectful, only missing tears streaming down his face. John Rivers desperately pleaded with his master to stop using such twisted punishment methods. Over the past few days, he had barely eaten proper meals, and the number of times he had been knocked off the horse was so frequent that even he had lost count. If this continued, he feared he wouldn't survive much longer. Ethan Stone was not a cold-hearted person, at least not when it came to John Rivers. Thus, he decided it was time to help his student understand the reason behind his methods. He wanted this insolent young man to realize that mastering skills wasn't as simple as having tea and a meal. In the room at the inn, Ethan Stone set down his teacup. "Close your eyes." John Rivers flinched. Damn it, not again. They had already played enough during the day, and now he wanted to continue into the night, reaching some transcendent level? His mind ran wild with thoughts, but John Rivers obediently closed his eyes. After all, he had already tried every method, pleading, whining, even rolling on the ground, and he knew all too well that none of them worked. It was better not to attempt them again. When people close their eyes, they usually see nothing but darkness. However, John Rivers was a bit different, not because he came from another world, but because his body had reflexes far beyond the average person. This trait could absolutely be described as non-human. Seeing John Rivers close his eyes, Ethan Stone slowly extended a finger, aiming it toward John Rivers' forehead. His movements were very slow. In truth, even if he moved extremely fast, he could do so without creating the slightest breeze. But considering that John Rivers was still a novice, Ethan Stone deliberately kept his actions slow. With his eyes shut, John Rivers couldn't see Ethan Stone's finger. Moreover, Ethan Stone's movements were both subtle and slow, so logically, John Rivers shouldn't have been able to sense it. However, just as Ethan Stone's finger was about to touch John Rivers' forehead, with only about an inch remaining, John Rivers moved. His head quickly tilted to one side. If Ethan Stone's finger continued to move forward, it would only point into empty space instead of pressing against John Rivers' forehead. Sensing something was off, John Rivers abruptly opened his eyes. His sharp eyes, slightly furrowed brows, resembled a heroic figure faced with an unsolvable riddle. However, if he didn't appear as though half his body was paralyzed while tilting his neck to one side, the image would have seemed a bit more composed. He knew he hadn't intended to move because he fundamentally didn't understand why he should. That's why he was astonished, surprised, and even fearful. If a person's body moves without being controlled by their consciousness, it would be difficult for anyone to accept. See that? Ethan Stone withdrew his hand and picked up the teacup again. John Rivers nodded. Understand now? Ethan Stone asked again. John Rivers quickly shook his head. Ethan Stone thought for a moment, trying to explain as clearly as possible. You already know that the body you have now was originally something I prepared for myself. In case of a failed ascension, even if my physical body were destroyed, as long as my soul and nascent spirit remained, I could seize another body and be reborn. Ethan Stone gently stirred the floating tea leaves with the lid of the cup, but still didn't drink. John Rivers chuckled awkwardly a few times. This was something he owed Ethan Stone, and he figured he probably wouldn't be able to repay it in this lifetime. Instead, he had lucked into a great advantage, while Ethan Stone and Victor Sage's years of effort ended up benefiting someone else. Letting out a sigh, Ethan Stone rotated the lid of the cup. But even though you know how rare this body is, you don't understand how much potential it holds. John Rivers truly didn't understand, so he listened attentively. To put it simply, the outer shell of the body you currently possess not only has meridians far superior to those of ordinary people, but also heightens sensory perception. That's why, even though you didn't see my movements earlier, your body instinctively reacted first. This reaction didn't even pass through your brain. Ethan Stone paused. What do you think? John Rivers' mouth went dry. What did he think? He felt like a monster. However, he also guessed Ethan Stone's next point. Because John Rivers' body had such incredible reflexes, Ethan Stone intended to further stimulate this instinct. For a martial artist, training the body to the point where it could automatically avoid a certain level of danger would be an enormous advantage. Finally, understanding Ethan Stone's good intentions didn't mean John Rivers was happy to accept them. Being tormented daily by all sorts of petty tricks, who wouldn't get annoyed? With a gloomy face, John Rivers asked, Master, is there truly no way to switch to a more humane method? Although strengthening the body and tempering the mind is an effective and inspiring approach, as a revered figure, can't you find another path? What momentarily excited John Rivers was that Ethan Stone replied with one word, all right. Hashtag Chapter 11, the so-called strongest. John Rivers was overjoyed. He was elated, though he had always hoped to attain an unbeatable divine skill that only existed in imagination, yet he disliked paying the equivalent price in hardship. Therefore, when Ethan Stone mentioned there was another method, John Rivers was ecstatic. But the next two words Ethan Stone uttered sent his excitement plummeting into despair. In your dreams, Ethan Stone said nonchalantly. Only in dreams could one effortlessly obtain what they desired, and the only price to pay was simply closing their eyes to sleep. John Rivers did not appreciate Ethan Stone's unexpected and joyless sense of humor. Of course, Ethan Stone had no reason nor need to care whether John Rivers liked it or not. In any case, his training methods would continue, as long as John Rivers remained alive. The picturesque landscapes of the heavenly capital kingdom were mesmerizing, gradually causing John Rivers to grow fonder of the place. The fresh river air, the occasional appearance of birds and forest creatures, sometimes, John Rivers truly felt that these peaceful days were what real life was about, even though it seemed less lively compared to his old world. Staying with Ethan Stone for a long time, John Rivers became more composed, his mindset calmer, and he gradually adapted to Ethan Stone's grueling training regimen. During meals, even with his eyes closed, John Rivers could not only savor the full delicious flavor of the food but also precisely and promptly defend himself with chopsticks. The grains of rice, flicked by Ethan Stone, would no longer land on him. Although this progress took several months, for anyone else, it might have taken years and still yielded no results. This was undoubtedly due to John Rivers' extraordinary physique, but he also felt quite satisfied with his perseverance in reaching the moment of success, admiring his own determination. In the depths of autumn, while John Rivers could still catch the leaves that Ethan Stone flicked with his eyes closed, it had become increasingly difficult to produce a melodious sound from the dry, golden leaves. Autumn is a season that easily stirs emotions, its desolate aura gradually spreading with the lowering temperatures, penetrating into everyone's heart, especially those who are sensitive. During certain periods, on one hand, John Rivers spent more and more time each day with his eyes closed. On the other hand, Ethan Stone thoroughly explained martial arts knowledge to his only disciple, withholding nothing. In other words, when Ethan Stone decided to give up the body he had originally prepared for himself and resolutely took John Rivers as his disciple, he had already made up his mind to keep no secrets. The longer they spent together and the more he was taught, the more John Rivers felt that his master might soon have to leave him. Although he understood deep down that Ethan Stone could not stay with him forever, John Rivers, having gradually developed a sense of reliance, still did not want to think about the day Ethan Stone would eventually leave. His master wanted to see what the outside world was like. John Rivers could understand this steadfast desire, even if he did not agree with it. Everyone possesses curiosity, and it is precisely this curiosity, in its various forms, that drives people to explore the mysteries of the world. However, Ethan Stone seemed to go further, his profound gaze already fixed on the world beyond. Being with Ethan Stone was not just about avoiding loneliness, especially in a new world. John Rivers knew that as long as his master was by his side, he would feel an unparalleled sense of safety. This sense of safety brought immense warmth, something John Rivers was clearly unwilling to let go of. Along the way, over the course of several months, John Rivers witnessed the banners and armored forces of the heavenly capital kingdom, observed the prosperity and order of this nation, and also saw the dark corners and pervasive indifference in places untouched by sunlight. Even the mightiest nation, the heavenly capital kingdom, could not escape the stratification of society. Where there were gallant generals riding noble steeds, there were also diligent farmers toiling away simply to fill their stomachs. Where there were elegant, carefree nobles, there were also frail, emaciated beggars. Where there were lavishly dressed women smiling and enticing patrons, there were inevitably stories behind them that were far from glamorous. None of this surprised John Rivers. Even in his own world, the so-called equality was, for the most part, just an empty phrase, let alone in a world and era resembling a feudal society like this. As for those who enjoyed wealth and luxury, John Rivers felt no envy, because he believed that with Ethan Stone's backing, living comfortably wouldn't be difficult. On the other hand, towards the impoverished common folk, John Rivers was equally stingy with his sympathy. This was because he knew he couldn't manage so much, their existence had its own reasoning. He never considered using the ideals and values of another world to reshape the face of this one. Moreover, ultimately, his purpose in coming to this world was simply to enjoy life. To enjoy a life that he could never have in his original world, nothing more, nothing less. As for whether he could return to the world where he had lived for nearly 30 years, John Rivers fundamentally did not care. He actually had little attachment to that place. A new world, a new body, a new life, this fulfilled everything John Rivers had ever dreamed of. Letting out a loud and exhilarating shout, or more accurately, a howl, John Rivers spread his arms wide in the mountain valley, releasing all his pent-up energy. Echoes of joyful sounds answered his call, further amplifying his sense of existence and leaving him in a state of utter relaxation. Ethan Stone sat cross-legged on the ground, calmly watching his disciple unleash himself like a wild beast. It wasn't until John Rivers, slightly winded, sat down beside him that Ethan finally spoke. "I've already passed on all the cultivation techniques to you. In truth, I don't hold rigid notions about sex or schools. So, if you choose to pass them on to others in the future, it's entirely up to you." Ethan Stone's tone was as composed as ever. John Rivers knew that the energy circulation method he practiced was Ethan Stone's own creation, a unique and unparalleled technique. Naturally, he wasn't foolish enough to carelessly share it with others. What truly piqued his curiosity was what Ethan Stone intended to teach him today. Ethan extended a single finger, his index finger. Unlike a few months ago, this time, the finger wasn't pointed at John Rivers, but rather at a large boulder not far away. The boulder seemed to tremble slightly before it began to crumble, eventually disintegrating into a pile of rubble. John Rivers tried his best to mask his astonishment. Such strength from Ethan Stone was, after all, within the realm of his imagination. Even so, he couldn't help but swallow hard. The cultivation methods of martial artists, at their core, are similar, enhancing the body, merging with the breath of heaven and earth, and transforming the microcosm of one's body to achieve greater power. Yet, each person's techniques are unique, and their martial arts specialties differ. For example, some excel in swift and powerful strikes, while others master sword techniques at the spirit connection realm. Ethan Stone was always very patient when explaining things to John Rivers. Thanks to this, John Rivers could easily understand what was being said. Although in his previous world he wasn't a martial artist, he at least knew about the 18 classical weapons like sabers, spears, staffs, and clubs. He also knew martial arts like Tai Chi, Bagua Palm, and Deadly Kick. In essence, they were all forms of martial arts, just with different focuses and tools as weapons. That move earlier must be the strongest martial technique of master, John Rivers said, his eyes filled with admiration. Earlier, when Ethan Stone executed the technique, it seemed so casual, like a flick of his sleeve to swat away an annoying fly. John Rivers didn't feel any overwhelming aura or surging internal energy. It was as if only the shattered rock bore witness to the terrifying power of that single strike. I call this move Stone Void Finger, Ethan Stone continued. John Rivers sincerely replied, Master must be very proud of his strongest martial technique. Its power is truly astonishing. Even though it seemed effortless to shatter a rock from a distance, John Rivers firmly believed Ethan Stone was far more powerful than what he had just displayed. Hearing this, Ethan Stone slightly furrowed his brows. Why would I be proud? John Rivers was stunned. It's the strongest martial technique of Master, so why are you dissatisfied? Precisely because of the words strongest, I am dissatisfied, Ethan Stone replied. Confused, John Rivers couldn't understand why Ethan Stone would say such a thing. He felt his master wasn't the type to boast out of humility, which only deepened his bewilderment. Why can a single finger exert such force, yet a clenched fist cannot possess the same power? Ethan Stone posed the question. John Rivers couldn't answer because he truly didn't know how to respond. In the novels he had read or the movies he had watched, the great heroes always had their unique ultimate moves, punches, kicks, palms, and finger strikes dazzlingly displayed, leaving people in awe. It seemed like an established rule, and everyone had grown accustomed to it. But John Rivers had never considered this. If they were truly masters, why did Guo Jing practice the 18 dragons subduing palms and not the 18 dragons subduing fists? Why was Shiman Chueshua no longer divine without his sword? It seemed there was indeed a problem hidden within. If there truly is a path to ultimate perfection, then there would no longer be anything called the strongest martial technique, because the strongest must be one who masters balance, just like the heavens and earth. Because my power is not yet balanced, there exists something called the strongest move. And this so-called strongest move is merely a manifestation of my inadequacy. Since John Rivers didn't understand, Ethan Stone explained it to him. The strongest individual at the pinnacle of martial arts is absolutely not someone who has mastered a single type of fist technique or sword technique to its utmost limit. To stand at that peak, one must demonstrate comprehensive strength. There is no longer such a thing as a signature skill, because every part of the body is equally powerful. Whether armed or barehanded, a martial artist who possesses ultimate strength fundamentally does not need to rely on any restricted form of power. If fists can create destruction, then legs can do the same. The body and strength are perfectly fused into one, that is the true, complete martial artist. Across the entire continent, this realm is undeniably a true legend, as no one has ever reached it, despite countless people imagining and striving for it. This realm is called the Heaven Assimilation Realm. Chapter 12, The Stylish Bandit. Entry Stage, 100 Barriers Realm, Spirit Connection Realm, Heaven Assimilation Realm, Path Realization Realm. Regardless of the type of cultivator, be it a martial artist, sorcerer, or formation master, all fall within these 5 realms. If there are levels beyond these 5 realms, then perhaps only gods and deities would reside there. John Rivers still couldn't fully comprehend Ethan Stone's words. The idea that the strongest is merely a sign of not being strong enough, a concept resembling a Zen riddle, failed to spark John Rivers' interest. Ethan Stone, renowned as the #1 worldly expert on the continent, was once asked by John Rivers about his realm of cultivation. When Ethan Stone replied that he was at the Spirit Connection realm, John Rivers couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. As the greatest master and his own teacher, John Rivers believed Ethan Stone should stand at the pinnacle of all cultivators. That way, not only would he gain prestige, but naturally, he would also enjoy more benefits. There was one thing Ethan Stone didn't mention. According to him, there were currently fewer than 10 people on the continent who had reached the Spirit Connection realm. Of course, reclusive masters hidden in the mountains and forests, or by lakes and seas, were not included in this count. Under the guidance of Ethan Stone, John Rivers began channeling his immature inner energy, following a unique meridian circulation method, attempting to practice the stone void finger. This was the first time in his life he had tried using a martial technique, and he felt a mix of excitement and anticipation. He slowly sensed the heat building up in his finger. When the inner energy condensed to an uncontrollable level, he resolutely thrust it forward. His finger pointed into the empty air until the heat at his fingertip gradually dissipated. John Rivers felt a bit embarrassed. Initially, he had wanted to mimic Ethan Stone, breaking a rock from a distance with a single finger. However, apart from piercing through the air, his stone void finger failed to cause any destruction. With your current abilities, being able to execute this move is already quite impressive. If you want to reach my level, Ethan Stone paused for a moment, there's still a long road ahead. At first, he intended to say it would take decades of hard work before dreaming of such feats, but to avoid discouraging John Rivers, he chose a more tactful and subtle way to express it. Even if Ethan Stone hadn't said it, John Rivers understood. Nothing can be achieved overnight. Although John Rivers disliked hardship, he understood that to gain something, one must pay the corresponding price in effort. He wasn't in a hurry because he had never aspired to dominate the world. Even if Ethan Stone didn't impart all his lifelong cultivation insights and ultimate techniques to him, John Rivers wouldn't complain, as cultivation was never something he deeply desired. John Rivers curled the index finger of his right hand, recalling the searing sensation at his fingertip moments ago. Though he had yet to master striking from a distance, learning this technique alone had satisfied him. In just a few short months, his dantian had formed genuine qi, his body's reflexes now fully aligned with his consciousness, and he had even learned the stone void finger technique. These achievements were clearly the hallmark of a martial arts prodigy seen only once in a millennium. Yet John Rivers hadn't considered that, without his unique physique, such progress wouldn't have come so easily. Ethan Stone stood up, and his horse immediately understood its master's intentions, obediently walking to his side. I had planned to send you to the Virtuous Waters Kingdom Academy. The young people there will undoubtedly learn many things that will prove useful to you in this world, Ethan Stone said, stroking the horse's mane. The horse obediently lowered its head, embodying complete submission. John Rivers glanced at his own horse. It responded with a disdainful side eye and a dismissive snort before continuing to graze on the grass. Compared to the lush green grass, John Rivers' face couldn't spark any excitement at all. Even his ability to handle animals was far inferior. It seemed there was still a long road ahead, John Rivers sighed. The disciple will follow the master's arrangements, John Rivers said firmly. Getting the chance to attend university again wasn't bad at all. In fact, John Rivers believed the happiest time in his life was those few short years in college. Now having the opportunity to relive it was something he couldn't ask for more. However, with your personality, I think traveling 10,000 miles will be more beneficial than reading 10,000 books, Ethan Stone suddenly shifted his tone. John Rivers inwardly cried out, please no. Even if he went to that so-called Imperial Academy, John Rivers had no genuine desire for extensive learning, he simply liked the environment there and fantasized about the young ladies in the academy. Therefore, no matter what, John Rivers believed that his days at the academy would undoubtedly be far better than the grueling miles of arduous journeys. Master, can you stick to your original decision? I still want to go to the academy, John Rivers said respectfully. No, Ethan Stone replied firmly. Then there's nothing left to discuss. What should I do next? Just give me your instructions, Master, John Rivers said, his tone growing weary. Ethan Stone suddenly turned around and mounted his horse. What comes next is for you to decide for yourself. I must leave now, take care of things on your own. John Rivers stood there, stunned. Although he had long known his master would leave, this felt too abrupt. Not even a few more words of farewell? Wasn't this a bit too dramatic? Hurriedly stepping forward to grab the reins, John Rivers looked up with a pitiful expression. Master, this is irresponsible. How am I supposed to survive on my own? You're not a child. If you want to live, you'll figure it out. Then when will we meet again? When the time comes, you'll know. Master, this kind of response, like that of a monk, is truly heartless. But in the end, John Rivers couldn't change the outcome. And so, John Rivers finally let go of the reins, allowing Ethan Stone to ride off leisurely on horseback, disappearing from his sight and leaving behind a cold, unfeeling silhouette. Standing there in a daze for a moment, John Rivers felt a deep sense of frustration. Ethan Stone not only left without a single word of sentiment, but more importantly, the old man didn't leave him a single coin. Having traveled with his master for so long, whether it was for meals or lodging, Ethan Stone had always been the one paying. John Rivers had always been curious about just how much silver was hidden within that loose, flowing robe of his. Now that Ethan Stone was gone, John Rivers naturally found himself reduced to a penniless vagabond. The so-called "not a penny to his name" perfectly described his current state. After all, he was still his master. John Rivers suppressed the urge to curse and slowly turned to lead his horse. The beast was leisurely chewing on some grass, glancing at John Rivers with an expression that seemed full of mockery. John Rivers chuckled and patted the horse's head. "Your poor master is down on his luck, and yet you seem so pleased. Do you believe I won't sell you off to plow the fields? Let this fine steed spend its days working the land like an ox." His horse impatiently shook its head and snorted as if in protest, clearly showing no respect for its owner. John Rivers had to admit that ever since arriving in this world, not only had he encountered people with strong personalities, but even beasts with distinct characters. "Golden A, you're running so fast, did you manage to catch any rabbits?" "Oh right, Golden A, forget about catching rabbits, I wouldn't know how to start a fire anyway, and I'm not used to eating raw food. Golden A, with my skills, what kind of work do you think would make me the quickest money? Golden A, can you stop eating while we're walking? I'm starving here, don't you know that?" John Rivers rambled on endlessly, his conversation partner being none other than his horse, which he had named Golden A. Though the name sounded more fitting for a dog than a horse, John Rivers didn't care. As for whether the horse minded, well, he couldn't care less about that either. Golden A strolled along leisurely, occasionally taking a bite of some flowers or grass that caught its eye, chewing slowly with half-closed eyes, completely at ease. John Rivers, on the other hand, was starving. Unfortunately, unlike his horse, he couldn't just munch on grass, so he had no choice but to endure his hunger. Leaving the mountain valley, John Rivers was contemplating his growling, empty stomach when Golden A suddenly halted, scraping its hooves in apparent dissatisfaction. As a noble steed, Golden A naturally understood that unless its master commanded otherwise, it should keep moving forward, unless, of course, there was no path ahead. In this case, it wasn't that Golden A had carried John Rivers to a dead end, rather, someone was blocking their way. With a person obstructing the path, advancing further was impossible, so Golden A had no choice but to stop. The man stood boldly in the middle of the road, arms crossed, carrying a sheathed longsword on his shoulder. His gaze was disdainful, his demeanor arrogant. Though John Rivers had never been a victim of highway robbery, he'd seen enough to recognize the situation. Judging by the scene, he immediately identified the man as a bandit intent on ambushing travelers. However, the man's professional attire and demeanor earned John Rivers admiration for his dedication to the craft. Dressed in a tight black outfit, a hooded black cloak, and a black mask covering his face, his style was strikingly bold, almost alluring. The longsword in his hand was also a standard weapon. Having spent considerable time traveling with Ethan Stone, John Rivers had learned that adventurers often favored this type of sword. The blade was long and sturdy, slightly broader near the hilt, making it ideal for both slashing and thrusting without breaking easily. Truly, it was a practical weapon. John Rivers couldn't help but chuckle in amusement. He was very hungry, but he had no money to fill his stomach. Just now, he had thought about resorting to robbery to make money, but after all, such a method was far from honorable, leaving him hesitant and conflicted. Moreover, he hadn't encountered any passers-by yet. Now, it seemed like the opportunity to make money had arrived. Robbery might not be good, but if it's robbing the robber, then it should be judged differently. John Rivers decided he would rob the bandit who was preparing to commit robbery. Although his martial skills were still at a beginner's level, John Rivers believed that with a few months of training from his master and his naturally strong physique, dealing with a petty thief would be as easy as flipping his hand. In fact, with John Rivers' current abilities, a dozen or even 20 ordinary thugs wouldn't pose much of a challenge for him. However, John Rivers, in his smugness, clearly overlooked one thing: blocking the road to rob people was something petty thieves did, but that didn't mean all those who blocked roads to rob were petty thieves. Sometimes, even masters could stoop to doing something lowly. Leaping off his horse, John Rivers flashed a smile that he believed to be his most charming. "This mountain is mine, this tree is mine. If you want to pass here, sir, you'd better be sensible." John Rivers rubbed his thumb, index, and middle fingers together, making a universally understood gesture. #### Chapter 13, The First Drop of Saliva. Feeling disrespected, Goldeneye found it hard to accept the reality that the bandits didn't even want to rob him. He raised his head and let out a roar, shaking his head as he looked toward John Rivers, as if to say, "Let me deal with him." John Rivers deeply despised those who were full of themselves. Although the other party's outfit had all the makings of a wandering knight, a bandit was still a bandit. At best, they might know a few clumsy tricks. No matter how convincing the disguise, they could never truly be a genuine wandering knight. One must understand that being a wandering knight wasn't as simple as wearing a cloak and wielding a sword. To become one first had to reach the cultivation level of entry stage. John Rivers decided to teach this bandit, who dared to insult the title of a wandering knight, a proper lesson. At the same time, he planned to take all his silver as punishment. Without wasting any more words, he let out a loud shout to bolster his courage and charged forward, throwing a punch. The bandit, seeing John Rivers attack him, whether out of a desire for revenge or some other motive, responded with a punch of his own. The two fists collided in an instant. A dull thud echoed as the masked man trembled, while John Rivers staggered backward several steps. He inwardly cursed, this bandit was actually a shameless wandering knight. How disgraceful. John Rivers felt bitterness in his mouth. A wandering knight, a cultivator at the entry stage. John Rivers had clearly not yet reached the entry stage. The title of a wandering hero was one held in high regard by all. Over the course of its long history, the hooded cloak and the heavy longsword had become the iconic equipment of this profession. Thus, the wide, hooded cloak came to be known as the wandering hero cloak, and the longsword wielded by wandering heroes was naturally called the wandering hero sword. Any group capable of establishing such formalities surely had a proud tradition, as well as a complete organizational structure. From hundreds of years ago, even before the Alexander dynasty unified the continent, the Wandering Hero Guild had already existed. Let us not forget, King Alexander himself, who laid the foundation for his empire, was originally just a wandering hero. Claiming the title of a hero, the principles of wandering heroes were to root out evil and uphold justice, scorning all despicable acts. It was precisely because of this that John Rivers mistakenly assumed the person he encountered was merely a shameless, death-defying bandit dressed in a counterfeit hero's attire. Based on what he had learned about the continent during this time and the teachings of Ethan Stone, John simply could not believe that any true wandering hero would stoop to such underhanded deeds. After all, if the Wandering Hero Guild were to discover such actions, the consequences would undoubtedly be fatal. There was no time to ponder why a wandering hero would fall to such depths. John Rivers clenched his wrist, flexing his finger joints. The blow from earlier had left him in excruciating pain, deep into his bones. If not for his particularly robust physique, that punch might have shattered his fist entirely. This was the disparity in their levels. Though his opponent was just a lower-tier entry-stage fighter, he was far beyond the reach of an ordinary martial artist. The wandering hero seemed intrigued. The young man before him not only managed to withstand his punch, but also appeared unscathed, a truly peculiar sight. Through their brief exchange, the masked wandering hero had already gauged John Rivers' strength. This boy was merely a martial artist who had not yet reached the entry stage, and a low-tier one at that. Yet, despite being so low tier, he had faced the hero head-on, remained unharmed, and showed no intention of retreating. Is this a form of contempt? The Wanderer's gaze turned cold. John Rivers truly had no intention of running away, and the reason was straightforward. First, he wasn't confident he could escape before his opponent killed him, so he'd rather stay and take his chances. Although he knew his adversary's level was higher than his own, he believed that, thanks to his physical advantages, he wasn't entirely without a shot. Secondly, this was the first time he'd ever fought someone. Even in his previous world, John Rivers had never engaged in a physical altercation with anyone because he was timid and lacked courage. Now, he finally had the opportunity to fight someone for the first time, and this wasn't just an ordinary scuffle, it was a battle that could very well decide life or death. As a result, he was thrilled. It seemed as though the timidity in his soul had vanished with the transformation of his body. He acknowledged that his opponent might be stronger, but he felt no fear. John Rivers licked his lips like a wolf. Right now, he was eager to taste the flavor of blood, whether it was his opponent's or his own. With a loud shout, John Rivers used the strength of his waist and legs to throw another punch. No technique, no elaborate moves, just a simple, straightforward punch. He was well aware of his own strengths and weaknesses. Flashy techniques like spinning full strike or scattered flower hands were fundamentally unsuitable for him. Simple, unembellished, but effective attacks were his rightful choice. This time, the masked wanderer no longer exchanged punches with him but slightly tilted his body, lightly stepping aside to evade his strike while simultaneously delivering a punch to his ribs. The masked wanderer was very confident in his fists, especially when facing a clearly inexperienced young man. Therefore, when his confident punch missed, he was momentarily taken aback. Just as the fist was about to make contact, John Rivers suddenly twisted his body, dodging the ferocious attack. At the same time, he turned his punch into a horizontal sweep aimed straight at the opponent's throat. This was the result of Ethan Stone's training. If John Rivers' eyes could see it, his body would undoubtedly react in time. Even unconsciously, his body could instinctively respond to a certain extent, avoiding injury. The Wanderer's surprise left him slightly flustered. Although John Rivers' sweeping strike didn't hit his throat, the force it carried still caused cold sweat to bead on his forehead. Being pushed to such a degree by a youngster he had underestimated left the Wanderer somewhat enraged. John Rivers ignored him, his fists moving like a tiger and dragon, completely reckless, refusing to stop until his opponent was defeated. The Wanderer dodged a few strikes, but seeing John Rivers relentlessly attacking without pause, in his fury, he planted his feet firmly and decided to face him head-on. The fists of the two clashed repeatedly and then parted, arms blocking each other's strikes, knees aiming maliciously at the opponent's lower body. Even childish tricks like stomping on feet were employed by John Rivers, though to no avail. Each collision made John Rivers feel as if his bones were about to crack, but he could only grit his teeth and endure, refusing to retreat. Despite taking several heavy blows, including a punch to the face that almost shattered his teeth, his eyes burned red as he continued the fight. John Rivers was determined not to give his opponent a chance to catch their breath. Of course, given his weaker position, such determination seemed somewhat laughable. But as long as he kept dragging the fight out this way, his opponent wouldn't have the opportunity to draw their sword. He could withstand a few punches, but John Rivers wasn't confident he could survive even a single slash from the blade. The wandering swordsman grew somewhat disheartened. This battle was nothing like what he had imagined, a one-sided slaughter or an evenly matched duel. Instead, it was filled with the dirty tricks of a street brawler. John Rivers punched, kicked, headbutt, and even tried biting. This unorthodox fighting style made it difficult for the swordsman to adapt, and perhaps this was the very reason he hadn't yet defeated John Rivers. But the proud swordsman had had enough of these underhanded tactics, especially when, in the middle of fighting, John Rivers suddenly spat a mixture of saliva and blood straight into his face. John Rivers wasn't just spitting to disgust his opponent, because doing so would only target a single point, which the swordsman might easily dodge. Instead, John Rivers unleashed a burst. His lips moved quickly, producing an unpleasant sound, and then a mouthful of saliva was turned into hundreds of tiny droplets, splattering all over the swordsman's face. It was somewhat nauseating. The swordsman was truly furious. Although his face was masked, part of it was still exposed, and it ended up being hit by the opponent's spit attack. Some of the spit even landed in his eyes. Such a despicable and shameless attack could undoubtedly serve as a justification for killing. The swordsman resolved to kill his opponent with his own sword. John Rivers finally landed a successful strike, but he felt no joy whatsoever. At this moment, he was remarkably calm. Although he had resorted to a childish and disgraceful spit tactic, it wasn't because he had run out of options or gone mad to the point of losing all reason. Despite having no prior experience in life-or-death combat, as a shut-in who had read countless books, John Rivers understood the importance of staying calm in such situations. If he couldn't intimidate his opponent, then he would provoke him. People with unstable emotions are more likely to reveal openings, thus increasing his chances of victory. John Rivers wasn't wrong in his thinking. Unfortunately, this assumption only exists between evenly matched opponents. When two tigers fight, the one who remains calmer will likely have a higher chance of victory than the one consumed by rage. But if it's a tiger facing a rabbit, no matter how frenzied, irritable, or disoriented the tiger becomes, the poor rabbit still has no chance of winning. In the face of such unequal strength, the psychological factor's influence can essentially be disregarded. Therefore, John Rivers' thinking was flawed. Provoking the opponent didn't cause him to lose his reasoning or judgment. Instead, it spurred the opponent to directly punch John Rivers backward and suddenly draw his sword. John Rivers staggered back a few steps. Confronted with the gleaming sword of the wanderer, he clenched his fists, then released them, repeating this motion over and over. His heartbeat began to race, and his body seemed to stiffen slightly. He truly felt the threat of life and death. Hashtag Chapter 14, Blood Flow witnesses a good deed. The wanderer drew his sword, a long and heavy blade capable of being wielded with either one hand or two. At this moment, the wanderer, consumed by rage, gripped the unusually long hilt with both hands. In this stance, if he struck with his full strength, splitting John Rivers in half would be no problem at all. The long sword tilted upward, its tip pointing directly at the center of John Rivers' forehead, yet the wanderer did not strike immediately. John Rivers knew he was about to face a strike at full force. To be honest, he had no confidence whatsoever. Apart from his physical advantage in speed and strength, he couldn't compare to his opponent in any other way. Even if he managed to dodge the first strike, as soon as his opponent changed his attack, it would be nearly impossible to avoid the second blow. Moreover, evading endlessly wasn't a viable solution. Ultimately, he wouldn't escape the sharp edge of the sword. Thus, John Rivers pondered whether he should even attempt to dodge in the first place. The pause lasted only a brief moment. The wanderer, gripping the sword with both hands, slightly shifted his elbows back, preparing to thrust forward. Initially, he intended to deliver a downward slash, cleaving his opponent in half. But as he faced the young man in black before him, an unexpected and unwelcome emotion crept into his heart: fear. Even he himself did not understand why, despite having greater martial strength than his opponent, he felt a trace of fear. Although it was fleeting, passing through his heart and quickly dissipating, he still decided to proceed cautiously. Using a downward slash might appear imposing, but applying too much force could leave him unable to follow up with the next move. Thus, he chose to thrust rather than slash. However, he did not expect that even a simple thrust would fail to execute properly.